Kyle had been a park ranger for 3 seasons at the northern edge of a vast wilderness preserve that stretched across thousands of acres of dense forest, rocky terrain, and isolated valleys where cell phone signals disappeared and GPS devices often malfunctioned. He was not the type to scare easily. He had grown up in rural country north of Toronto, spent his teenage years hunting and fishing with his grandfather, and believed he understood the patterns of nature better than most people. The forest was his workplace, but it had also become something close to home. He preferred the rhythm of the wilderness to the chaos of urban life, and he found peace in the solitude that came with patrolling miles of trail without encountering another human being for days at a time. During late autumn, when the tourist season died down and the trails emptied of hikers and campers, Kyle preferred the solitude even more. The silence of the woods felt cleaner than the noise of civilization. The animals moved differently when humans were not constantly invading their territory, and Kyle enjoyed observing their natural behavior without the interference of crowds. He had always believed that the forest was predictable if someone knew how to read it properly. Weather patterns, animal movements, seasonal changes, all of it followed logical rules that made sense to anyone who paid attention. That belief was shattered during his final patrol of the season, an experience so disturbing that Kyle requested a transfer to a different park hundreds of miles away and refused to ever discuss what had happened in detail with anyone, except the investigators who questioned him afterward. It happened during the last week of October. The park was nearly deserted, with only a handful of dedicated hikers and photographers still visiting the remote trails. Kyle was one of only 2 rangers still stationed at the preserve, and his patrol area covered the northern section where the terrain became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The trails there were poorly maintained, and signs warned visitors that they were entering backcountry where rescue operations could take hours or even days if someone got injured or lost. Most people avoided that area entirely, which was exactly why Kyle enjoyed patrolling it. The fog had rolled in thick that afternoon, turning the familiar trails into ghostly corridors where visibility dropped to maybe 15 feet at best. Every sound seemed muffled and distorted, as if the fog itself was absorbing noise and reshaping it into something unnatural. Kyle was finishing his final patrol of the day, planning to head back to his cabin before darkness made navigation impossible, when he noticed something unusual near an unauthorized trailhead that was supposed to be gated and locked. There was a truck parked there, windows fogged over from the inside, doors locked, engine cold, but not completely frozen. The truck looked abandoned, yet something about it felt wrong. Kyle walked around the vehicle, shining his flashlight through the windows, and saw nothing obviously alarming inside. No blood, no signs of struggle, just an empty interior with a jacket thrown across the back seat and an empty coffee cup in the holder. He tried the doors, but they were all locked. Kyle radioed the truck's license plate number to dispatch, but the signal was weak and kept cutting out. After several attempts, he finally got through, and dispatch told him to wait for backup before investigating further. But Kyle could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The truck's engine was still warm, which meant whoever had driven it there had not been gone long. And the location was bizarre. The trailhead was supposed to be closed, and getting past the gate required either cutting the lock or climbing over it with the vehicle, neither of which seemed likely given that the gate appeared intact. Kyle decided he could not wait for backup. If someone was injured on the trail, every minute could matter. He grabbed his emergency pack, checked his radio one more time, and started down the trail, following a set of fresh boot prints that led into the fog. The boot prints were erratic, zigzagging across the trail like the person who made them had been confused, disoriented, or possibly panicking. They occasionally veered off the path entirely, then returned to it as if the person had gotten lost and corrected course. Kyle followed them for nearly 20 minutes, moving slowly and calling out periodically to announce his presence as a park ranger and ask if anyone needed assistance. The fog grew thicker the deeper he went, until Kyle could barely see 10 feet ahead. His flashlight beam seemed to dissolve into the white void, creating strange shapes and shadows that disappeared when he moved the light to focus on them directly. That was when he first heard the voice. It was faint and distant, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing and footsteps. "Help me. Please help me." The voice sounded desperate, frightened, and unmistakably human. Kyle stopped and shouted back, asking for the person's location and assuring them that he was a park ranger coming to help. But the voice did not respond to his questions. It just kept repeating the same plea over and over, always from a slightly different direction. Kyle quickened his pace, trying to home in on the source of the voice. But every time he thought he was getting closer, the voice seemed to shift and come from somewhere else entirely. After another 10 minutes of following the voice through the fog, Kyle saw a figure stumble out from behind a cluster of trees about 30 feet ahead. It was a man, clothes torn and dirty, face pale and gaunt, moving with the unsteady gait of someone on the verge of collapse. Kyle rushed forward and caught the man just as his legs gave out beneath him. The man was shivering violently, his skin cold and clammy to the touch, his eyes wide and unfocused. Kyle lowered him to the ground carefully and started asking questions. What was his name? How long had he been out here? Was he injured? Was anyone else with him? The man's lips moved, but at first no sound came out. Then, in a hoarse whisper, he said his name was Mark. He had been lost for 3 days. He needed to get out of the forest immediately. When Kyle asked him about the truck at the trailhead, Mark's entire body went rigid. His eyes focused suddenly, locking onto Kyle's face with an intensity that was almost frightening. Mark grabbed Kyle's jacket with surprising strength and pulled him closer. "Do not go further down the trail," he said urgently. "You have to get me out of here now. We have to leave right now." Kyle tried to calm him down, explaining that he needed to assess Mark for injuries before moving him and that an ambulance would need to meet them at the trailhead. But Mark was not listening. He kept repeating that they had to leave immediately, that it was not safe, that something was wrong with the forest. Kyle assumed the man was suffering from hypothermia or dehydration, both of which could cause confusion and irrational behavior. He reached for his radio to call for medical support, and that was when they both heard it. A voice, clear and unmistakable, calling from somewhere deeper in the fog. "Help me, please. I am in the trees. Help me." Kyle froze. The voice sounded exactly like the one he had been following for the past 30 minutes. But he was here now, with the man who had been calling for help. So who was that? Mark's eyes went even wider and he shook his head violently. "Do not answer him," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They are not real. It mimics people. It pretends to be lost. It uses voices to bring you deeper." Kyle stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. "What do you mean it mimics people? What is it?" But before Mark could answer, his body began to convulse violently. Mark's back arched unnaturally, his head thrown back, his mouth open in a silent scream. Foam appeared at the corners of his lips, and his eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. Kyle immediately shifted into emergency response mode, trying to stabilize Mark and keep his airway clear while simultaneously attempting to reach dispatch on his radio. But the radio emitted only static now, no matter which channel he tried or how he adjusted the antenna. The fog seemed to press in closer, thicker, until Kyle could barely see 5 feet in any direction. Mark's convulsions stopped as suddenly as they had started. His body went completely limp, and for a terrible moment, Kyle thought he had died. But then Mark's eyes snapped open again, staring straight up at the fog-covered sky, and his mouth moved. Words came out, but they were not in Mark's voice anymore. It was something else, something that sounded like multiple voices layered over each other, speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. The words were incomprehensible, not any language Kyle recognized. Then Mark's head twisted to the side, far beyond what should have been physically possible, rotating almost completely backward until he was staring directly at Kyle despite his body still facing upward. Kyle scrambled backward, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Mark's face was blank, expressionless, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then, slowly, impossibly, Mark began to stand. But he did not stand the way a human being stands. His body rose from the ground in one fluid motion, as if being lifted by invisible strings, his limbs hanging loosely until he was fully upright. He stood there for several seconds, swaying slightly, his head still twisted at that impossible angle. Kyle's hand went to his service weapon, but he could not bring himself to draw it. This was not a threat he understood, not something he had been trained to handle. Then Mark collapsed, not the way he had risen, but suddenly and completely, like a puppet whose strings had been cut all at once. He hit the ground hard, and this time, Kyle could see immediately that he was dead. There was no breathing, no pulse, no signs of life whatsoever. Kyle finally managed to get his radio working again, and within seconds he was shouting for emergency backup, for medical support, for anyone who could hear him to respond. His voice was shaking, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. He knew he sounded panicked, unprofessional, but he could not help it. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. The rescue team arrived 45 minutes later, though it felt like hours to Kyle. They brought portable lights and medical equipment, and they immediately went to work examining Mark's body. Kyle watched from several feet away, still shaking, unable to look directly at Mark's twisted form. The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, but after only a few minutes, they pronounced Mark dead at the scene. They could not identify an immediate cause of death. No obvious wounds, no signs of trauma, no indication of what had killed him. When Kyle gave Mark's description and explained where he had found him, one of the senior rangers pulled him aside. His face had gone pale. "What did you say his name was?" the ranger asked. Kyle repeated that the man had said his name was Mark, that he had been lost for 3 days, and that he had been trying to warn Kyle about something in the forest before he died. The senior ranger was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his phone and showed Kyle a photograph. "Is this him?" Kyle looked at the photo and felt his stomach drop. It was Mark, unmistakably the same man. But the photo was from a missing persons report filed 6 years earlier. Mark had disappeared while hiking in this exact area, and despite extensive search operations, no trace of him had ever been found. Kyle insisted there had to be a mistake. The man he had found was real, physical, not a ghost or hallucination. The senior ranger did not argue, but he did explain that a search team would be sent out immediately to investigate the area where Kyle had found Mark. If someone had been surviving in the wilderness for 6 years, or if there was evidence of foul play, they needed to know. Kyle was told to return to the ranger station and write a detailed report of everything that had happened. He did as instructed, though his hands shook so badly he could barely type. The search team returned 8 hours later with disturbing news. They had followed the trail Kyle described, using his GPS coordinates and his written directions. But according to their findings, no such trail existed in that area. The coordinates Kyle provided led to a section of forest so dense and overgrown that it was impassable without machetes to clear the way. There were no boot prints, no signs of human passage, No indication that anyone had been there recently. The truck that had been parked at the unauthorized trailhead was traced to a man who had reported it stolen 3 weeks earlier from a parking lot 200 miles away. The truck yielded no forensic evidence connecting it to Mark or to anyone else. The official report concluded that Kyle had found an unidentified individual suffering from severe medical distress, possibly a drifter or homeless person who had been living rough in the forest. The disorientation and confusion Kyle experienced was attributed to the fog, exhaustion, and the stress of the situation. Mark's true identity was never definitively established, though dental records eventually suggested he might have been the missing hiker from 6 years earlier. How he had survived that long, where he had been, and what had happened to him remained complete mysteries. The cause of death was listed as undetermined pending further investigation, but no further investigation ever took place. Kyle knows what he saw. He knows what he heard. And he knows that Mark tried to warn him about something before he died. The locals who live near that forest have their own explanations. Stories passed down through generations about things that live in the deep woods. They talk about mimics, entities that can copy human voices and appearances, that build false trails and lure people deeper into the wilderness, where they can never find their way out. They say the fog is when the mimics are most active, when the boundary between the real world and whatever exists in the deepest parts of the forest becomes thin. Kyle does not patrol that area anymore. He requested and received a transfer to a different park in a different state, somewhere with shorter trees, less fog, and trails that stay exactly where they are supposed to be. But even there, in his new posting hundreds of miles away, Kyle sometimes hears a voice at night when he is alone in his cabin. It comes from just past the tree line, faint and distant, calling for help. And every time he hears it, Kyle locks his doors, closes his windows, and refuses to respond. Because he knows now that some voices in the wilderness should never be answered, and some trails should never be followed, no matter how desperate the plea for help might sound. Tom worked as a park ranger at a sprawling national park known for its dense old-growth forests, rugged mountain terrain, and hundreds of miles of backcountry trails that attracted serious hikers and wilderness enthusiasts from across the country. The park was remote enough that cell phone coverage was non-existent in most areas, and the nearest town with a hospital was over an hour's drive from the main ranger station. Tom had been working there for 2 years, and he had come to appreciate the isolation and self-sufficiency that the job required. He bunked at the staff quarters, a cluster of small cabins situated about 3 miles from the main visitor center, along with several other rangers who rotated through different patrol schedules throughout the season. The work was mostly routine during the off-season, when tourist numbers dropped dramatically. Tom spent his days checking trail conditions, monitoring wildlife activity, maintaining facilities, and occasionally assisting lost or injured hikers who had underestimated the difficulty of the terrain. He had encountered bears on multiple occasions, dealt with aggressive wildlife, and rescued hikers suffering from everything from twisted ankles to severe dehydration. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what happened one August night when the summer season was winding down and the park was transitioning into the quieter autumn months. It was close to 11 o'clock at night, and Tom had just finished his shift and returned to his cabin. He had changed into comfortable clothes, made himself dinner, and was planning to read for an hour before going to sleep. The cabin was small but functional, with a single bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchenette, and a living area with a wood-burning stove that Tom rarely needed during the summer months. The windows were open to let in the cool night air, and Tom could hear the familiar sounds of the forest settling down for the night. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, wind rustling through the pine trees. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that Tom had grown to love about living in the wilderness. Then he heard voices. They were high-pitched, desperate and growing louder as they approached his cabin. Tom immediately recognized the sound of people in distress. He grabbed his flashlight and pulled on his boots, not bothering to change out of his sweatpants and t-shirt, and hurried to the door. Before he could open it, frantic knocking erupted against the wood, hard and insistent. Tom opened the door quickly and found himself face to face with two young women, both in their early 20s, both pale and terrified. One of them had a jacket tied awkwardly around her left shoulder, and blood was soaking through the fabric, dark and wet in the beam of his flashlight. Tom immediately went into emergency response mode. He brought them inside, turned on all the lights, and grabbed his first aid kit from the cabinet. The woman with the injured shoulder collapsed onto his floor, breathing heavily, her face twisted in pain. Her friend kneeled beside her, holding her hand and speaking in a shaky voice, trying to reassure her that everything would be all right. Tom kneeled down and carefully removed the makeshift bandage to examine the wound. What he saw made his stomach turn. It was a bite mark, not from a bear or mountain lion or any other animal Tom had ever encountered in his years of wilderness work. The pattern was distinctly human, deep, vicious, and clearly made by human teeth that had clamped down with tremendous force and torn away flesh. The wound was bleeding heavily, and the edges were ragged and infected looking. Tom could see bruising around the bite that suggested the attack had happened hours earlier, and the woman was likely going into shock from blood loss and trauma. Tom asked what had happened, trying to keep his voice calm and professional, even though his mind was racing. The uninjured woman explained that they had been hiking one of the backcountry trails, planning to camp overnight at a designated site about 5 miles from the ranger cabins. They had been walking for about an hour after sunset, using headlamps to navigate, when they heard someone walking behind them on the trail. At first, they thought it was another hiker, which was unusual but not unheard of. They called out a greeting but received no response. The footsteps continued, keeping pace with them, staying just far enough back that they could not see who was following them. The women had started walking faster, feeling increasingly uneasy about the silent follower. The footsteps behind them matched their pace, speeding up when they sped up, slowing down when they slowed down. Then they heard breathing, heavy and labored, coming from the darkness just beyond the reach of their headlamps. One of the women turned around to confront whoever was following them, shining her light directly behind them. That was when they saw him. A man completely naked, standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet away. His skin was filthy, covered in dirt and what looked like dried blood. His hair was long and matted, hanging down past his shoulders, and he was smiling at them. Before either woman could react, the man charged. He moved with shocking speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. He tackled the woman who had turned to look at him, knocking her to the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of her. Then he bit down on her shoulder, his teeth sinking deep into her flesh. She screamed and tried to fight him off, but he was strong, far stronger than his emaciated frame suggested he should be. Her friend kicked him as hard as she could in the ribs, and he finally let go, rolling off and curling into a ball, making a high-pitched keening sound that was almost animalistic. The women scrambled to their feet and ran. They expected him to chase them immediately, but for a few precious seconds he stayed on the ground, still making that terrible sound. When he finally stood up and started running after them, they had a head start. They ran faster than either of them had ever run in their lives, abandoning their backpacks and camping gear, focused only on getting away. The man pursued them, and they could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind them, breathing heavily, occasionally making sounds that were halfway between words and growls. They ran for almost 30 minutes before they finally saw lights ahead and realized they were approaching the ranger cabins. The man was still behind them, though he had fallen back somewhat, When they reached Tom's cabin and started pounding on the door, they heard the footsteps stop. The man had apparently decided not to follow them all the way to the ranger station. By the time Tom opened the door, he was gone. Tom grabbed his radio and called his co-worker, another ranger named Mike, who bunked in a cabin about 200 yards away. Mike arrived within minutes, carrying his service weapon and a powerful spotlight. Tom explained the situation quickly, and Mike's face went pale when he saw the bite wound. He immediately agreed to stay with the women while Tom went to search for the attacker. Tom knew it was dangerous, possibly foolish, but those women needed protection, and the man who had attacked them was still out there somewhere, potentially a threat to anyone else in the area. Tom strapped on his duty belt, checked his pistol to make sure it was loaded and ready, and grabbed his most powerful flashlight. He put on his ranger jacket despite the warm night air, wanting the extra layer of protection and the authority of his uniform. He stepped out into the darkness, his heart pounding, his senses hyper-alert to every sound and movement around him. The forest that had felt peaceful and familiar an hour earlier now felt hostile and threatening. Tom moved carefully along the trail the women had described, his flashlight sweeping back and forth across the trees and undergrowth. He was looking for any sign of movement, the indication of where the attacker might have gone. The trail was well maintained here, wide enough for two people to walk side by side with clear sight lines in most directions. After about 10 minutes of walking, Tom found the backpacks the women had abandoned. They were lying in the middle of the trail, contents spilled out, clearly dropped in a panic. Tom continued forward, moving more slowly now, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. That was when he saw him. About 40 yards ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of large rocks near the trail, was a figure. Tom raised his flashlight, and the beam caught the man fully. He was exactly as the women had described. Completely naked, filthy, emaciated, with long matted hair. He was crouched down, hunched over something Tom could not immediately identify. The man was making wet, chewing sounds. Tom's flashlight beam hit the man squarely, and the man's head snapped up. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's eyes, glowing pale green in the darkness. For a long, terrible moment, they stared at each other. Tom could see now what the man had been eating. It looked like a dead rabbit, partially skinned, being consumed raw. Blood covered the man's face and hands, glistening in the flashlight beam. Tom shouted, identifying himself as a park ranger and ordering the man to get on the ground immediately. His voice was loud, authoritative, projecting all the command presence he had been trained to use in dangerous situations. But the man did not comply. Instead, he stood up slowly, rising to his full height, which was considerable. He was well over 6 feet tall, and despite his emaciated appearance, his frame suggested he had once been quite muscular. He stood there, swaying slightly, still holding the dead rabbit in one hand. Then he smiled. It was the same smile the women had described, wide and unnatural, showing teeth stained dark with blood. Tom repeated his command, louder this time, his hand moving to draw his weapon. The man tilted his head to one side, studying Tom with an expression that seemed almost curious. Then he spoke. His voice was rough and rasping, as if he had not used it in a very long time. "Are you alone?" he asked. The question sent a chill down Tom's spine. It was not what he had expected. There was a calculation behind it, an intelligence that contradicted the feral appearance and behavior. Tom did not answer. He drew his weapon, holding it in a ready position, finger alongside the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself. He gave one final command for the man to get on the ground with his hands visible. The man dropped the rabbit. Then, without warning, He turned and sprinted into the forest. But he did not run the way a normal person runs on difficult terrain in darkness. He moved with the speed and agility of something that knew the forest intimately, that could navigate it by instinct rather than sight. He disappeared into the undergrowth so quickly that Tom barely had time to react. Tom pursued for a short distance, but the man was gone, vanished completely into the darkness. Tom stopped, breathing hard, his weapon still drawn, listening intently for any sound that might indicate which direction the man had gone. There was nothing. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, no wind. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made Tom's skin crawl. He backed away slowly, keeping his flashlight and weapon ready, and made his way back toward the cabins. He radioed for law enforcement backup, providing as much detail as he could about the encounter and the direction the man had fled. Then he returned to his cabin, where Mike was still standing guard over the two women. The injured woman had been given first aid, and Mike had managed to slow the bleeding, but she clearly needed proper medical attention. Tom radioed for an ambulance, which arrived 20 minutes later along with 2 sheriff's deputies. The woman was transported to the hospital, where she received treatment for the bite wound and was given a series of vaccinations as a precaution against infection. Her friend was interviewed extensively by the deputies, and both women provided detailed statements about what had happened. Law enforcement officers and additional park rangers conducted an extensive search of the area over the next 48 hours. They brought tracking dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and dozens of personnel to comb through the forest. What they found was deeply disturbing. About 2 miles from where Tom had encountered the naked man, searchers discovered evidence of a long-term camp. It was well hidden in a natural depression surrounded by thick undergrowth, nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The camp contained disturbing evidence of prolonged habitation. There were bones scattered around a fire pit, some clearly animal, but others that required forensic analysis to identify. There were remnants of clothing, tools made from sharpened stones and animal bones, and carvings on nearby trees that seemed to mark territory or perhaps serve some other purpose investigators could not determine. Most disturbing of all, they found items that had clearly been taken from hikers. Backpacks, wallets, identification cards, cameras. Some of the items were recent, but others dated back years. Forensic analysis later confirmed that some of the bones found at the campsite were human. DNA testing identified remains from at least 3 individuals, all of whom had been reported missing while hiking in the park over the previous 6 years. The investigation expanded dramatically, becoming a multi-agency effort involving the FBI and state police. But despite the extensive manhunt, the naked man was never found. He had disappeared into the vast wilderness of the national park, and if he was still there, he knew how to avoid detection. Tom continued working as a ranger, but he transferred to a different section of the park, one with higher visitor traffic and more regular patrols. He never worked alone in remote areas again, always insisting on having a partner for backcountry patrols. The 2 women recovered physically, though both required extensive counseling for post-traumatic stress. The woman who had been bitten still bears the scars on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of how close she came to becoming another missing person statistic. Tom thinks about that night often. He thinks about the question the man asked him. Are you alone? It suggests planning, calculation, predatory behavior that goes beyond simple madness or survival instinct. It suggests that the man was evaluating Tom as potential prey, weighing the risks, deciding whether to attack or flee. Tom knows how lucky he was that the man chose to flee. He also knows that somewhere in that vast forest, in the places where maps end and trails disappear, there are predators far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. and some of them walk on two legs, smile with human teeth, and ask questions before they decide whether to kill. May worked as a park ranger at a sprawling wilderness reserve, known primarily for its extensive cave systems that attracted spelunkers and adventure seekers from across the region. The caves ranged from simple tourist-friendly chambers with guided tours to dangerous technical systems that required specialized equipment and training to navigate safely. Search and rescue operations were a regular part of May's job, though most incidents were relatively routine. Twisted ankles from hikers who underestimated the terrain, cases of dehydration during summer months, occasional broken bones from falls. May had been trained for cave rescue specifically, completing a rigorous certification program that covered rope work, confined space operations, and emergency medical response in underground environments. But despite all her training, she had never been called for anything truly serious. That changed one afternoon in early autumn. It was a Tuesday, typically one of the quieter days of the week, when a frantic hiker burst through the doors of the ranger station. He was out of breath, sweating heavily despite the cool temperature, and clearly in a state of panic. He identified himself as Balint and explained between gasps that two people had gone missing inside one of the park's most dangerous cave systems. Balint said he and his friend Mark had been hiking near the entrance to a cave that was officially closed to the public due to safety concerns. They had noticed a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crawling into the narrow entrance. Concerned that a child was entering such a dangerous area unsupervised, Mark had made the decision to follow the boy into the tunnel, assuring Balint that he would just make sure the kid was safe and would return in a few minutes. But Mark never came back. Balint had waited for nearly 20 minutes, calling into the cave entrance, hearing nothing but his own voice echoing back. Finally, worried that something had happened to his friend, Balint had crawled into the narrow tunnel himself, moving slowly and carefully, calling out for Mark. The tunnel extended about 50 yards before opening into a larger chamber, but Balint saw no sign of Mark or the boy. The chamber had multiple passages leading off in different directions, and Balint realized that attempting to search further without proper equipment or knowledge of the cave system would be suicidal. He had backed out, run the 2 miles to where his car was parked, driven until he found cell service and called for help. May immediately contacted the park superintendent and activated the search and rescue team. Within 90 minutes, 8 team members had assembled at the cave entrance, including 2 specialists with extensive caving experience. Balint was there as well, still visibly shaken, insisting on joining the search despite being advised to let the professionals handle it. He kept repeating that something had felt wrong about the whole situation. The boy had not responded when they called to him, had not looked back even once, and had moved in a strange, jerky manner that did not seem natural for a child. The team entered the cave system fully equipped with climbing gear, helmets with mounted lights, radios, rope, and emergency supplies. The entrance tunnel was exactly as Balint had described, narrow enough that they had to crawl single file, barely wide enough for an adult to fit through comfortably. The walls were damp and cold, and the air smelled of minerals and stagnant water. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 10 minutes of crawling, the tunnel opened into a chamber roughly the size of a large living room. Their helmet lights revealed several passages leading off in different directions, some sloping upward, others descending deeper into the earth. That was where they found Mark's backpack. It was lying in the center of the chamber, contents partially spilled out. Flashlight, water bottle, trail mix, a phone with a dead battery. But there was no sign of Mark himself, and no sign of the boy. The team leader made the decision to split into 2 groups to cover more ground while maintaining safety protocols. May's group consisted of herself, one of the cave specialists, and Balint, who had refused to wait at the surface. They would explore the passages that descended, while the other team would check the upward-sloping routes. May's group moved carefully through a passage that grew progressively narrower and steeper, descending at an angle that required them to use their hands to steady themselves against the slick walls. The temperature dropped noticeably as they went deeper, and the air became thinner, harder to breathe. The only sounds were their own breathing, the scrape of their boots against stone, and the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights. They had been descending for approximately 20 minutes when May heard something that made her blood run cold. It was a child's voice, faint and distant, calling for help. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, deeper in the cave system. May radioed the other team to report what they were hearing, and after a brief discussion, her team was given authorization to continue following the sound, while the other team maintained their current position as a safety anchor. They moved forward through a particularly tight passage that required them to turn sideways to fit through, their helmet lights casting strange shadows on the striated rock walls. The passage eventually opened into a massive cavern, far larger than any chamber they had encountered so far. Their lights could not reach the ceiling or the far walls. The space felt vast and ancient, as if they had descended into some primordial void that existed outside normal reality. And standing in the center of that vast darkness, barely visible in the beam of their helmet lights, was Mark. He was standing completely still, facing away from them, his posture rigid and unnatural. May called his name, her voice echoing strangely in the enormous space. Mark did not respond. The team approached cautiously, calling out to him repeatedly, asking if he was injured, if he could hear them. As they got closer, May could see that Mark's clothes were torn and filthy, and his hands were covered in blood. Deep scratches and abrasions covered his fingers and palms, as if he had been clawing desperately at the cave walls. When they finally reached him, and the cave specialist reached out to touch his shoulder, May shone her light on Mark's face and saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mark's eyes were open, but they were completely white. Not closed, not rolled back, but simply white, as if his pupils and irises had disappeared entirely. His mouth hung open slack, and a low whispering sound was coming from his throat. The whispers were not words, not in any language May recognized, but they were rhythmic and deliberate, as if Mark was reciting something. The cave specialist pulled his hand back immediately, and that was when Mark screamed. It was not a human sound. It was high-pitched and piercing, echoing through the cavern with such intensity that May felt it vibrating in her chest. The scream went on and on, impossibly long, as if Mark did not need to breathe. Then he collapsed. His body went rigid and he fell straight backward, hitting the stone floor hard. The team immediately went into emergency medical response mode. The cave specialist checked for a pulse and found one, weak and irregular. Mark's skin was ice cold despite the physical exertion of whatever he had been through. He was breathing, but barely, and his body was completely unresponsive to any stimuli. May radioed for an emergency extraction team while the cave specialist and Balint began the difficult process of preparing Mark for transport. Moving an unconscious person through narrow cave passages is extraordinarily dangerous, but leaving him there was not an option. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher using rope and emergency blankets, secured Mark as safely as possible, and began the arduous journey back to the surface. It took over 3 hours to navigate back through the passages, moving inch by inch, carefully maneuvering the stretcher through tight spaces, constantly monitoring Mark's vital signs. By the time they emerged from the cave entrance, it was fully dark outside. An ambulance was waiting, and paramedics immediately took over Mark's care. He was still unconscious, still unresponsive, his body temperature dangerously low despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. He was airlifted to a regional hospital with a specialized trauma unit, where doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. May provided a detailed report of everything they had found, but she deliberately left out the detail about Mark's eyes. She did not know how to explain it, and she was not sure anyone would believe her anyway. Mark remained in a comatose state for 3 weeks. During that time, May and the other team members were interviewed repeatedly by park officials and law enforcement. The cave system was extensively searched by professional spelunkers and rescue teams, but no trace of the young boy was ever found. No lost child had been reported in the area. No families had contacted authorities about a missing son. It was as if the boy had never existed at all, except that both Baylant and Mark had seen him, and Mark had followed him into the cave. When Mark finally regained consciousness, he had no memory of what had happened after he entered the cave. He remembered crawling through the entrance tunnel and seeing the boy ahead of him. But after that, nothing. Complete blank emptiness until he woke up in the hospital. He could not explain his injuries, had no recollection of clawing at the cave walls or how he had ended up in that massive cavern. Most disturbing of all, Mark insisted that from his perspective, he had only been in the cave for a few minutes. He had no sense that hours had passed, no awareness of the time that had elapsed between entering the cave and being found. Medical examinations revealed no obvious cause for his condition. No head trauma, no drugs in his system, no neurological damage that could account for the memory loss or the catatonic state he had been found in. His injuries were consistent with sustained physical exertion against rough stone surfaces. But doctors could not explain why he would have been clawing at cave walls or what had caused his eyes to appear the way May had described. The official report concluded that Mark had likely experienced a severe panic attack and psychological break triggered by getting lost in an unfamiliar cave system, combined with possible carbon dioxide buildup in poorly ventilated passages. May left the Park Service 6 months after the incident. She completed her remaining contract obligations, but she could not continue working in that environment. Every time she saw a cave entrance, she thought about that massive cavern and the sound of Mark's inhuman scream echoing through the darkness. She had nightmares about it regularly, dreams where she was back in that cavern and heard the child's voice calling for help. In her dreams, she followed the voice deeper and deeper into passages that seemed to extend forever, spiraling down into the earth, never reaching an end. Local folklore about the cave systems in that region includes numerous references to children's voices that lure people underground. Stories passed down through generations speak of caves that are doorways to something older and more dangerous than anyone can understand. Places where the normal rules of reality do not apply and where time moves differently. May does not know if she believes in such things, but she knows what she saw in that cavern. She knows the look on Mark's face and the sound he made, and she knows she will never set foot in another cave again, no matter the circumstances. Mike had been a park ranger for nearly 15 years, most of that time spent in remote wilderness areas where he could go days without seeing another human being. The solitude suited him perfectly. He had always been more comfortable in nature than in cities, more at ease with the rhythms of the forest than with the noise and chaos of modern life. Mike believed that the wilderness was where he truly belonged, where he felt most at peace with himself and the world. But that sense of peace was completely shattered during his final season as a ranger, an experience so profoundly disturbing that Mike left the profession entirely, moved to a different state, and refused to discuss what had happened with anyone except a therapist he eventually consulted years later. The incident occurred during the last week of October. The park was nearly empty, the tourist season long finished, and Mike was one of only 3 rangers still stationed at the remote outpost that served as the base for monitoring the northern section of the preserve. He was conducting a routine patrol of a trail that wound through particularly dense forest when he noticed something unusual. There was a clearing in the woods that Mike had never seen before, despite having walked this trail dozens of times over the years. The clearing was perfectly circular, approximately 20 feet in diameter, and the ground inside the circle was completely bare. No grass, no leaves, no undergrowth. Just dark soil that looked as if it had been freshly turned. What made it even stranger was that there was no obvious explanation for the clearing. It did not look like it had been burned. There was no smell of smoke and no charring on the surrounding trees. It did not look like it had been cleared by machinery. There were no tire tracks or tool marks. It simply existed. A perfect circle of bare earth in the middle of dense forest. Mike took photographs, marked the location on his GPS unit, and radioed a report to the park superintendent. He was told that someone would come out to investigate within the next few days, and that he should continue his patrol. That night, back at his cabin, Mike heard a voice outside. It started as barely more than a whisper, so faint that at first Mike thought he was imagining it. But as the evening progressed and darkness fell completely, the voice grew gradually louder and more distinct. It was calling his name, not shouting, but speaking it clearly and deliberately, over and over. Mike grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the tree line with the beam. There was nothing there, no movement, no signs of anyone hiding in the woods. He called out, identifying himself as a ranger and asking who was there. The voice did not answer his question. It just continued calling his name. Mike went back inside and locked the door, telling himself it was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on him after a long day. But the voice did not stop. It continued throughout the entire night, sometimes whispering, sometimes speaking at normal volume, always calling his name. The voice seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the woods behind the cabin, sometimes from the side, occasionally from directly in front of the door. Mike did not sleep at all that night. He sat in his living room with all the lights on, his service weapon on the table in front of him, listening to the voice call to him until the sun finally rose and it stopped. By morning, Mike was exhausted and deeply unnerved. He reported the incident to the park superintendent, who suggested that it might have been other rangers playing a prank, though Mike was certain it was not. The voice had sounded wrong somehow, not quite natural, with an odd resonance that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location it was coming from. The superintendent also suggested that the terrain might be creating unusual echo effects, distorting sounds from far away and making them seem closer. Mike did not argue, but he knew what he had heard was not an echo. Over the next week, the voice became a constant presence in Mike's life. It followed him on patrols, calling to him from the forest. It whispered outside his cabin every night, making sleep nearly impossible. Mike began experiencing other disturbing phenomena as well. Equipment would go missing from his cabin and then reappear hours later in places Mike had already searched multiple times. His GPS unit would malfunction in areas where he had never had signal problems before. Most disturbing of all, he began finding footprints in the soft earth around his cabin. The prints matched his own boots exactly, down to the specific wear patterns and distinctive tread markings. But Mike knew he had not made those tracks. Mike started documenting everything. He took photographs of the footprints, kept detailed logs of when the voice occurred and what it said, recorded the times when his equipment malfunctioned. He was trying to prove to himself that he was not losing his mind, that these things were really happening. But the more he documented, the more disturbed he became. The footprints appeared in impossible places, on surfaces where prints should not be able to form. The voice sometimes called to him using phrases that Mike had only thought, never spoken aloud. The breaking point came during a patrol, 8 days after he had first heard the voice. Mike was walking along a familiar trail, alert and tense, when he heard the voice calling from directly behind him. He spun around immediately, his hand going to his weapon, and saw himself standing there. About 30 feet back on the trail, staring directly at him, was what appeared to be Mike's identical twin. Same height, same build, wearing the exact same ranger uniform, even the same equipment belt. But the expression on the doppelganger's face was completely blank, emotionless, like a mannequin that had been made to look human, but had never actually been alive. Mike drew his weapon and shouted at the figure to identify itself, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound authoritative. The doppelganger did not respond. It did not move, did not blink, just stood there staring with those empty eyes. Mike repeated his command, louder this time, taking a step backward. The doppelganger smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that spread across its face, like something that had learned the expression by watching but did not understand what it meant. Then it turned and walked off the trail into the forest, moving with a strange, jerky gait that did not look quite natural. Mike did not follow it. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run, to get away from this place as quickly as possible. He turned and ran back toward his cabin, not caring about protocol or procedure, focused only on getting somewhere he felt safe. When he reached the cabin, he immediately began packing. He threw clothes and essential belongings into a duffel bag, grabbed his personal documents, and loaded everything into his truck. He did not file a report, did not inform the superintendent he was leaving, did not follow any of the proper channels. He just drove straight out of the park without stopping. Mike resigned from the Park Service via email 2 days later, sending a brief message stating that he was leaving for personal reasons and would not be returning. His supervisor tried repeatedly to contact him, asking for a proper explanation and requesting that he at least come back to complete an exit interview. Mike ignored all the requests. He refused to discuss what had happened, refused to return to the park even to collect belongings he had left behind. Eventually, the Park Service stopped trying to contact him, and Mike's sudden departure was officially attributed to a family emergency. Mike moved across the country to a city on the opposite coast, as far from that wilderness preserve as he could get without leaving the country entirely. He took a job in an office, something completely unrelated to wilderness work or outdoor recreation. He avoided forests, avoided hiking, avoided anything that reminded him of his time as a ranger. People who knew him before the incident said he had changed fundamentally, become quieter and more withdrawn, more anxious and hypervigilant. Because Mike still hears the voice, not every night, but often enough that he can never fully relax. Late at night, when the city is as quiet as it ever gets, he hears his name being called. It is fainter now, more distant than it was at the park, but it is definitely the same voice. Mike has tried therapy, tried medication for anxiety and sleep disorders, even tried consulting with people who deal in spiritual or paranormal matters. Nothing has helped. He is convinced that whatever was in that forest followed him when he left, that it latched onto him somehow and will never let go. Mike sleeps with lights on now and keeps background noise running constantly, television or music or anything to fill the silence. Because in silence, the voice is louder. In silence, he can sometimes hear footsteps outside his apartment that sound exactly like his own. The forest that he once loved has become the source of his deepest fear. He knows he will never feel truly at peace again, will never feel safe in darkness or silence. Whatever called to him from that circular clearing in the woods is still calling, and Mike does not know if it will ever stop. Ellen had worked as a park ranger for 7 years, specializing in cultural preservation and education programs that connected visitors with the historical and spiritual significance of the land. Part of her job involved protecting sites of historical importance within the park boundaries, including several areas that were considered sacred by indigenous communities who had inhabited the region for thousands of years before it became a protected wilderness area. Ellen had always approached this work with genuine respect and care, understanding that these places held deep meaning that extended far beyond what she could fully comprehend as an outsider. She worked closely with tribal representatives to ensure that sacred sites remained protected from vandalism, unauthorized access, and the general degradation that can occur when culturally significant areas are not properly monitored. One autumn evening, Ellen received a concerning report from a hiker who had been exploring near the park boundaries. The hiker claimed to have seen a group of people conducting some kind of ceremony in an area that was clearly marked as restricted and closed to all public access. The restricted area in question was a sacred site that had been officially closed for decades due to its cultural importance. Access required bypassing multiple locked gates and ignoring numerous signs that explicitly warned against trespassing. Ellen was immediately alarmed, knowing that any unauthorized activity in that area was not only illegal, but also deeply disrespectful to the indigenous communities who still considered the site sacred. Ellen decided to investigate immediately rather than waiting until morning. She gathered her equipment, including a radio, camera to document any trespassing, and her official ranger identification. She informed the park superintendent of her plans and estimated she would be back within 2 hours. The drive to the restricted area took nearly 40 minutes along poorly maintained access roads. By the time Ellen arrived at the locked gate that marked the boundary, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense forest. She parked her vehicle, unlocked the gate using her ranger keys, and proceeded on foot along the narrow trail that led to the sacred site. The forest was unusually quiet. Ellen noticed immediately that she could not hear any birds, no insects, none of the normal ambient sounds that typically filled wilderness areas during evening hours. The silence felt oppressive and wrong, making every footstep she took seem unnaturally loud. As she approached the sacred site, she began to smell something burning. It was not ordinary wood smoke, but something else entirely. Something organic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. Ellen proceeded cautiously, one hand on her radio, ready to call for backup if the situation warranted it. When she reached the clearing where the sacred site was located, Ellen stopped and stared, in complete disbelief at what was before her. In the center of the clearing was a large circle constructed from stones, each roughly the size of a human head, arranged with obvious precision. Inside the stone circle were symbols painted on the ground in what appeared to be blood, though Ellen desperately hoped it was just red paint. Surrounding the circle were dozens of small animal skulls, arranged in intricate geometric patterns that suggested deliberate planning and design. In the very center of it all stood a tall wooden pole, easily 8 feet high, with something tied to the top. Ellen squinted, trying to see what it was in the fading light. The shape was disturbingly humanoid, though she could not determine if it was a mannequin, a doll, or something else. Ellen raised her radio to call for backup, knowing that this situation was far beyond what she should handle alone. But before she could press the transmit button, she heard movement behind her. She spun around and saw figures emerging from the tree line in multiple directions. There were 6 of them, all wearing long dark robes and masks constructed from animal skulls. Deer skulls, bear skulls, smaller animals she could not immediately identify. They moved silently, their robes making no sound despite moving through underbrush and fallen leaves. Within seconds, they had encircled Ellen, cutting off any route of escape back to the trail. One figure stepped forward from the circle. This one was taller than the others, wearing a robe that appeared to be made from darker material and a mask fashioned from what looked like a wolf's skull. The figure raised one hand and spoke in a language Ellen did not recognize. It was not any indigenous language she had heard during her cultural training, not Spanish, not any European language she was familiar with. The words were harsh and guttural, with sounds that seemed difficult for human vocal cords to produce. The figure spoke with unmistakable authority, and the tone was clearly a command or warning. Ellen found her voice, though it shook as she spoke. She identified herself as a park ranger and stated that they were in a restricted area and needed to leave immediately. She explained that the site was protected by law and that they were committing multiple violations by being there. The tall figure did not respond to her words. Instead, it gestured toward the stone circle and spoke again in that unknown language. The other figures began to chant in response, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Ellen could feel it in her chest, in her bones, a frequency that felt wrong on some fundamental level. Ellen tried to use her radio again, pressing the transmit button and speaking urgently into it, requesting immediate backup and providing her location. But the radio emitted only static, no matter which channel she tried or how she adjusted it. The tall figure stepped closer to Ellen, close enough that she could smell the musty odor of the robe and see details of the wolf skull mask. The figure reached up slowly and removed the mask, revealing the face of an elderly man beneath. His skin was deeply weathered and lined with age, his hair completely white, his eyes cold and calculating as they studied her. The man spoke to Ellen in English this time, his voice quiet but carrying clearly despite the chanting that continued around them. He told her that she had no understanding of what she had stumbled upon, that some places were not meant for outsiders regardless of their official authority or good intentions. He explained that the land remembered things that predated her culture's claim to it, that there were obligations older than the government that employed her. He said that if Ellen reported what she had seen, there would be consequences. Not threats against her personally, he clarified, but consequences for the balance that they were working to maintain. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures dispersed back into the forest in different directions, vanishing into the darkness between the trees. Ellen was left alone in the clearing, her heart pounding, her hands shaking as she tried once again to use her radio. This time it worked, connecting her immediately to dispatch. She requested backup urgently, reporting unauthorized activity at the sacred site. Within 10 minutes, she heard vehicles approaching along the access road. Rangers and law enforcement officers arrived with lights and emergency equipment, prepared for a confrontation with trespassers. But when they entered the clearing with Ellen, it was completely empty. The stone circle was gone. The symbols, the skulls, the wooden pole, all of it had vanished. The ground showed no evidence that anything had been there at all. No disturbed earth where stones had been placed. No residue from the blood or paint used for the symbols. No impressions where the skulls had rested. The clearing looked exactly as it should have looked, undisturbed and protected. Ellen was questioned extensively. Her colleagues believed that she had seen something. Her distress and fear were genuine. But the complete absence of physical evidence made it impossible to pursue an investigation. Inquiries with local indigenous leaders turned up nothing useful. The tribal representatives Ellen had worked with for years expressed concern about the incident, but said they had no knowledge of any groups conducting unauthorized ceremonies at the site. They suggested that there were always people who misappropriated indigenous spirituality for their own purposes, mixing genuine traditions with invented rituals in ways that were disrespectful to actual cultural practices. Ellen continued working as a ranger, but she never returned to that section of the park. She requested that her duties be reassigned to areas that did not include monitoring the restricted sacred sites. She began researching historical records and folklore, discovering numerous references to secretive groups that allegedly practiced ancient rituals in remote wilderness areas. Most academics dismissed these references as legend or sensationalized accounts. But Ellen was no longer certain. She knows what she saw. She knows the warning she received was genuine. To this day, Ellen avoids working alone in remote areas of the park. And she has come to understand that there are forces in the wilderness that exist beyond official recognition, operating according to rules that predate modern law and authority. Kay had been a park ranger for 3 years, working primarily in search and rescue operations during the busy summer season when the park saw tens of thousands of visitors. She was known among her colleagues for remaining calm under pressure and her ability to handle difficult medical emergencies in remote locations where professional medical help could be hours away. During her time as a ranger, Kay had dealt with everything from heat exhaustion and dehydration to broken bones, heart attacks, and severe allergic reactions. She had seen people in extreme distress, witnessed traumatic injuries, and handled situations that would have overwhelmed someone without her training and temperament. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what happened one afternoon in late July. Kay received an emergency call on her radio from hikers on one of the park's most popular trails. A man had been found wandering near the trail in obvious medical distress. He was severely injured, incoherent, and needed immediate assistance. Kay grabbed her medical kit and emergency supplies, radioed her location and destination to dispatch, and drove as quickly as she could along the access road that led to the trailhead. When she arrived approximately 15 minutes later, she found 2 hikers standing over a man who was lying on the ground in the shade of a large pine tree. The man was convulsing, his body jerking violently, foam visible at the corners of his mouth. Kay's training took over immediately. She assessed the scene quickly, checking for immediate dangers, then moved to the patient to begin evaluation and treatment. But as soon as she got a clear look at the man's injuries, she realized this was far worse than anything she had encountered before. The man's body was covered in severe burns, third-degree burns across his arms, chest, neck, and face. His clothing was mostly burned away, hanging in charred tatters from his body. The smell of burned flesh was overwhelming, making Kay's eyes water and her stomach turn. She forced herself to focus, to push past the visceral horror and do her job. But what disturbed Kay most was that there was no fire anywhere in the area. No smoke, no burn marks on the surrounding vegetation, no scorched earth. Nothing to explain how this man had sustained such catastrophic burn injuries. The hikers who had found him said he had simply stumbled out of the forest already in this condition, that they had not seen or smelled any fire. Kay immediately radioed for an air ambulance, knowing that the man needed to reach a hospital as quickly as possible if he had any chance of survival. She also called for additional rangers to assist and to begin an investigation of the surrounding area to determine what had happened. While Kay worked to stabilize the patient, cleaning and covering the burns as best she could with the supplies in her medical kit, the man briefly regained consciousness. His eyes opened, unfocused and filled with pain, and he seemed to recognize that someone was helping him. He reached out with a burned hand and grabbed Kay's wrist with surprising strength for someone in his condition. He pulled her closer and whispered something in a hoarse, damaged voice. Kay had to lean in to hear him over the sound of his labored breathing. "They took me," he whispered. "They burned me. Not the only one." His eyes were desperate, pleading, as if he was trying to convey something vitally important. Kay asked who had taken him, where this had happened. But before he could answer, his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. His grip on her wrist loosened and his arm fell back to the ground. Kay continued working, monitoring his vital signs, doing everything she could to keep him stable until the air ambulance arrived. 2 other rangers arrived within 20 minutes, including Tom and Ellen, both experienced search and rescue personnel. They helped Kay continue treatment while also beginning to search the immediate area for any clues about what had happened. The air ambulance arrived 30 minutes after Kay's initial call, landing in a nearby meadow. The flight paramedics took over the patient's care, moving him quickly onto a stretcher and into the helicopter. Kay provided them with a rapid briefing on his condition and what little information she had been able to gather. The helicopter lifted off, rushing the burned man toward the nearest trauma center over an hour away by ground. The man died 4 hours after arriving at the hospital. Despite the best efforts of the burn unit staff, his injuries were too severe and his body went into shock and organ failure. The official cause of death was listed as massive trauma from burns covering over 60% of his body surface area. But the medical examiners who performed the autopsy were baffled by the nature of the injuries. The burns were consistent with exposure to extreme heat, but the pattern did not match any known source. They were not consistent with fire, not with chemical burns, not with electrical burns, not with any standard burn mechanism the doctors had encountered in their careers. It was as though the man had been subjected to intense, directed heat that left no residue, no trace, no evidence of what had caused it. Kay could not let the incident go. She began investigating on her own time, looking through recent missing person reports for the region, trying to find any pattern or connection. She discovered that over the previous 6 months, 3 people had been reported missing while hiking in the park. All 3 were solo hikers who had ventured into remote backcountry areas. None of them had been found, despite search efforts. Kay brought her findings to the park superintendent and requested authorization for a focused search operation in the area where the burned man had been found. The superintendent agreed, and a team of 8 rangers was assembled for a 2-day search operation. They combed through dense forest and difficult terrain, following drainage patterns and checking areas where someone might establish a hidden camp. On the 2nd day of searching, they made a discovery that confirmed Kay's worst fears. Hidden in a ravine about 3 miles from where the burned man had been found was evidence of a campsite. It was well concealed, located in a natural depression that was invisible from above and difficult to access without knowing exactly where to look. The camp showed signs of recent activity. There were multiple fire pits, though none showed evidence of the extreme heat that would have been necessary to cause the burned man's injuries. There were supplies, tarps, rope, and disturbing implements that suggested someone had been living there for an extended period. Most horrifying were the restraints. Ropes tied to trees in configurations that were clearly designed to hold a person immobile, and in shallow graves nearby, partially concealed with branches and leaves, they found human remains. Law enforcement was called immediately, and the area was secured as a crime scene. Forensic teams spent days processing the site, documenting everything, collecting evidence. Analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to 2 of the 3 missing hikers. The victims had been held captive, subjected to prolonged torture, and eventually killed. The 3rd missing hiker was never found, and investigators feared that person's remains might be located elsewhere or that the victim might have been the burned man himself, though identification was difficult given the extent of his injuries. Despite intensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, the perpetrator or perpetrators were never identified. The evidence suggested a transient individual or possibly a small group had been using the remote wilderness as a base for their crimes, taking advantage of the vast area and limited ranger patrols to operate undetected. Increased patrols and surveillance were implemented throughout the park, but no arrests were ever made. The case remains open, though investigators acknowledge that whoever was responsible has likely either left the area or ceased their activities. Kay left the Park Service 3 months after the investigation concluded. She could not continue working in a place where such horror had occurred. The image of the burned man, his desperate whisper, the knowledge that he had suffered unimaginable pain before dying, all of it haunted her constantly. She moved to an urban area and took an administrative job that had nothing to do with wilderness work or emergency response. She still has nightmares about that day. Dreams where she finds more victims in that ravine, people she could not save. People who suffered alone in the wilderness while she was patrolling trails just miles away. Kay knows now that there are monsters in the world who hide in beautiful places. The wilderness that she had loved, that she had dedicated herself to protecting, had become a hunting ground for predators who understood that isolation provides opportunity for evil. She will never look at remote forests the same way again. Will never feel that sense of peace and safety she once associated with wild places. Some trails lead to darkness that cannot be escaped, and some encounters leave scars that never truly heal.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a descent into fear with 8 of the most disturbing true trucker horror stories ever documented. These accounts are not drawn from highway folklore or roadside legends, but from the lived ordeals of professional drivers whose nights on America's interstates became unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Each story takes us deep into isolated highways and shadowed truck stops, revealing chilling encounters that span from unexplained radio transmissions to terrifying confrontations with forces both human and otherworldly. The testimonies have been meticulously preserved from first-hand accounts shared within the trucking community, ensuring that the authenticity of these experiences remains uncompromised, while driver names and specific routes have been altered to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell, so you never miss a single night when the unknown comes calling from the darkness between cities. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own highway experiences or which story disturbed you the most. I need to tell someone about what happened to me and my partner on a lonely stretch of highway in rural Texas 6 months ago. The authorities classified it as an attempted robbery, but that does not even come close to describing the organized nightmare we stumbled into that night. My name is Christopher, and I have been driving team with my partner Jake for 3 years. We thought we knew how to handle ourselves on the road, thought we understood the dangers that came with hauling valuable cargo through remote areas. We were wrong. It was a Tuesday night in late March, and we were hauling a load of electronics from Houston to Dallas. Nothing unusual about the run, just expensive enough that the company insisted on a team operation for security. Jake was sleeping in the bunk while I took the night shift, driving through the kind of empty Texas countryside where you can go 20 miles without seeing another vehicle. Around 2:45 a.m. I spotted what looked like a car accident about half a mile ahead. Emergency flashers were blinking on the shoulder, and I could see figures waving flashlights trying to flag down traffic. My first instinct was to help. In 15 years of trucking, I had stopped at dozens of accident scenes, pulled people out of burning cars, called for ambulances, done whatever I could to help fellow travelers in distress. But something about this scene felt wrong from the beginning. For one thing, there were too many people. A typical accident might have 2 or 3 individuals involved, maybe a passerby who had stopped to help. But I counted at least 6 figures moving around the disabled vehicle, which appeared to be a sedan tilted at an odd angle on the shoulder. The pattern of their movements was too coordinated, too purposeful for people who were supposedly dealing with an emergency. I slowed down and pulled into the right lane, intending to stop and offer assistance despite my growing unease. That is when I noticed the second red flag. The disabled car's hazard lights were flashing, but I could not see any actual damage. No crumpled fenders, no broken glass glittering on the asphalt. No sign of the impact that should have put the vehicle there. As I brought my rig to a stop about 50 yards from the scene, one of the figures jogged toward my cab. He was a tall man in his 30s, wearing jeans and a work shirt, carrying a flashlight and moving with the kind of confident stride that comes from being in complete control of a situation. "Thank God you stopped," he called as I rolled down my window. "We have got a real bad situation here. Driver is trapped and we need to get this car moved before another vehicle comes around that curve and plows into us." I woke Jake up and filled him in quickly while the man waited by my door. Jake climbed into the driver's seat to get a better look at the scene, and I could see him frowning as he studied the layout. "Something is not right about this," Jake whispered to me. "Look at how those other people are positioned. They are not trying to help with the car. They are watching the road in both directions like they are standing guard." I looked more carefully and realized Jake was absolutely right. The other figures were spread out in a defensive perimeter, some facing north, others south, all of them alert and watching for approaching traffic. It was the kind of formation you might see from a military unit or a well-trained criminal organization. "What kind of help do you need exactly?" I called down to the man by my window. "We need your truck to pull the car back onto the road," he replied smoothly. "Got a tow strap right here. Just take a minute and you will be on your way." That is when I noticed the third red flag. Despite supposedly dealing with a serious accident for God knows how long, none of these people looked stressed or hurried. Their clothes were clean, their movements calm and methodical. The man talking to me was not sweating, was not showing any signs of the adrenaline that comes with a genuine emergency. Jake made the decision for both of us. "We are going to call this in to the state police," he announced loudly enough for the man outside to hear. "They will have a tow truck out here within the hour." The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The man's friendly demeanor dropped away like a mask being removed. "I do not think you understand the situation," he said, his voice now cold and threatening. "We need your cooperation right now." That is when I saw the gun. He had been holding it low against his leg, hidden from view, but now he raised it until the barrel was pointing directly at my chest. At the same moment, the other figures around the disabled car stopped pretending to work on it and turned their attention fully toward our truck. "Driver, you need to shut off that engine and step out of the cab," the gunman ordered. "Both of you, hands where we can see them, no sudden movements." My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, but years of training kicked in. Every trucking company drills their drivers on what to do in a hijacking situation. Comply with demands. Do not resist. Do not try to be a hero. The cargo is insured. The company would rather lose the load than lose their drivers. But Jake had different ideas. "Hold on tight," he whispered to me, then slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The gunman tried to jump clear as 40 tons of truck and trailer lurched forward, but Jake deliberately swerved toward him. I heard the man scream as he dove for the ditch, and then we were past the fake accident scene and accelerating down the highway. That should have been the end of it, but these people were not giving up easily. As we gained speed, I could see headlights in my mirrors. Multiple vehicles were pursuing us, and they were gaining fast. "These guys are serious," Jake said through gritted teeth, pushing our loaded rig as hard as it would go. "This is not some random robbery. This is organized." The first vehicle caught up with us about 3 miles down the road. It was a pickup truck with 2 men in the cab, and they pulled alongside us on the left. The passenger was leaning out the window with what looked like a rifle, trying to get a clear shot at our tires. Jake swerved hard to the left, using our weight advantage to force the pickup off the road. I watched in the mirror as it spun out and rolled into the ditch, but there were still at least 2 more vehicles behind us. There! Jake pointed ahead to a cluster of lights about 5 miles in the distance. That has got to be a town. If we can make it there, we can get help. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. The remaining pursuit vehicles took turns trying to disable our truck, shooting at our tires, attempting to ram us from behind. Jake drove like a man possessed, using every ounce of his skill to keep us on the road and moving toward those distant lights. We were less than a mile from what we hoped was safety when disaster struck. One of the pursuing cars managed to get alongside us on the right, and I could see the driver gesturing for Jake to pull over. When Jake ignored him, the car suddenly swerved into us, trying to force us off the road. Jake overcorrected, and I felt our trailer start to jackknife. For a moment that seemed to last forever. We were sliding sideways down the highway at 60 miles per hour, the screaming of locked-up brakes filling the air. Then physics took over and our truck rolled. I remember the sensation of being thrown around the cab like a rag doll, the deafening crash of metal and glass, the acrid smell of diesel fuel and burning rubber. When the world finally stopped spinning, I was hanging upside down in my seat, blood running down my face from a dozen cuts. "Jake?" I called out, but there was no answer. I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and fell to what was now the ceiling of the cab. Jake was unconscious, hanging limp in his restraints, blood pooling beneath his head. I could hear voices outside, the sound of footsteps crunching on broken glass. "Get them out of there," someone was shouting. "We need to make this look like an accident." That is when I realized these people intended to kill us. This had never been about just stealing our cargo. They wanted to eliminate the witnesses. I managed to kick out the windshield and crawl through the opening just as the first man reached the wreckage. In the darkness and confusion, he did not see me slip away into the tall grass beside the highway. From my hiding spot, I watched in horror as they pulled Jake's unconscious form from the cab. "This one is still breathing," one of them said. "Not for long," another replied. I wanted to help my partner, wanted to rush back and fight for his life, but I was outnumbered and unarmed. The only thing I could do was try to get help, assuming I could make it to town without being caught. The next hour was a nightmare of crawling through ditches, hiding in culverts, and trying to stay ahead of the search parties I could hear spreading out behind me. These people were professionals, organized and methodical in their pursuit. They had radios, they had night vision equipment, and they knew the terrain far better than I did. By sheer luck, I managed to reach the outskirts of the small town just as dawn was breaking. I stumbled into the first business I found open, a diner that served the early morning crowd, and collapsed at the counter. "Please," I gasped to the startled waitress, "and call the police." My partner. They took my partner. The state police response was immediate and massive. Within an hour, there were dozens of officers at the crash site, but it was too late. The hijackers had vanished, taking Jake with them and leaving behind only our overturned truck and a crime scene that told no clear story. The investigation lasted for months, but they never found Jake. The FBI believed we had stumbled into the territory of a sophisticated cargo theft ring that had been operating throughout Texas and Louisiana. The fake accident scene was just one of several methods they used to stop and rob commercial vehicles. But we were the first drivers who had tried to fight back. I learned later that there had been at least 12 similar hijackings over the previous 2 years, but in every other case, the drivers had cooperated and been released unharmed after their cargo was stolen. We were the exception, the ones who fought back, and Jake paid the price for our resistance. I quit team driving after that. I could not stand the thought of putting another partner at risk, could not bear the responsibility of making life and death decisions for someone else. I still drive, but only solo runs, and I avoid remote areas whenever possible. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice that night, if Jake and I had just surrendered quietly. Would he still be alive today? The FBI agent assigned to the case told me that fighting back was the correct decision, that these criminals had probably killed drivers before and would have killed us regardless. But knowing that does not make the guilt any easier to carry. The worst part is not knowing what happened to Jake, not knowing if he suffered, if he had any final words, if he understood that I tried to save him. The not knowing eats at you in ways that definite knowledge, however terrible, never could. If you are a driver reading this, learn from my mistake. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Do not stop for accidents that look too neat, too organized. And if you do find yourself in a situation like ours, remember that your life is worth more than any cargo, no matter how valuable. This happened to me about 3 months ago, and I still have trouble sleeping some nights because of it. I have been driving trucks for over 15 years, and I thought I had seen everything the highway could throw at me. But that cold March night on Interstate 80 in Nevada taught me that the road still has secrets I never want to discover again. I was making my usual run from Sacramento to Salt Lake City. It was just past 3:20 a.m., and I was running on black coffee and pure stubbornness. The highway was empty. Nothing but endless desert and the occasional coyote caught in my headlights. My Peterbilt was humming along nicely, the radio was playing some late-night blues, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm every trucker knows. 6 more hours to my destination, and then I could grab some real food and maybe 8 hours of sleep. That is when I saw him. At first, my tired brain processed it as a mirage. There was no way anyone would be out here on foot at this hour, especially not in the middle of nowhere with nothing but salt flats and Joshua trees for miles. But as I got closer, the figure solidified into the unmistakable shape of a man with his thumb out, asking for a ride. I slowed down, my air brakes hissing as I pulled over onto the shoulder. Through 15 years of trucking, I had picked up plenty of hitchhikers. Most were just down on their luck, trying to get to the next town or find work. But something about this man made every instinct I had start screaming warnings. He jogged up to my cab window as I rolled it down just an inch. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, thin build, wearing jeans and a red flannel shirt with black work boots. But his skin had this washed-out, almost translucent quality, like he had never seen sunlight or was caught perpetually under fluorescent lighting. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and when they settled on me, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where you headed?" I called through the glass. "East." "Anywhere east," he replied, his voice oddly flat and emotionless. Every fiber of my being told me to drive away, but the thought of leaving someone stranded in this desolate stretch weighed on my conscience. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in slowly, sitting rigidly upright and clutching a battered backpack. The scent that came with him was strange. It was not the smell of sweat or the road, but something sharp and antiseptic, like ammonia mixed with fresh paint. The cab temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment he settled into the seat. I shifted back into drive and merged onto the highway, trying to make conversation. "Name is David," I offered. He nodded but did not return the greeting. Instead, he stared straight ahead through the windshield, his fingers gripping that beat-up pack like his life depended on it. I tried again. "Where exactly are you coming from?" The man shrugged, the slightest hint of what might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nowhere, really. Just traveling." The next 20 minutes passed in complete silence except for the steady drone of my engine and the rhythmic slap of tires on concrete. I found myself alternating between watching the empty highway ahead and sneaking cautious glances at my passenger. I had picked up enough hitchhikers over the years to recognize the signs. Some were running from trouble, others were just down on their luck. But this man went beyond nervous or cautious. There was something fundamentally wrong about him. That is when I noticed it in my mirrors. Out of habit, I checked my side mirror for what must have been the 100th time that night. What I saw made my blood turn to ice. The man sitting right beside me cast no reflection. In the dim glass, I could see the empty passenger seat, the dashboard lights, even the texture of the upholstery. But where my passenger should have been, there was absolutely nothing. I blinked hard, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Not enough sleep, too much caffeine, maybe the stress of the long haul was finally getting to me. But every time I glanced at that mirror, the same impossible sight greeted me. Empty seat, no shadow, no shape, no reflection at all. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I focused on the road ahead, trying to control the panic that was building in my chest. Stories my grandfather used to tell came flooding back. Tales from rural Arkansas about haints and lost souls, about the dead who walked between midnight and dawn, forever seeking rides to places they could never reach. The silence in the cab became suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel cold sweat trickling down my back despite the heater running full blast. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. But every primal instinct I possessed was screaming that I was sharing my cab with something that should not exist. "I need to drop you at the next rest stop," I said finally. My voice carefully controlled despite the fear clawing at my throat. The man slowly turned his head to look directly at me. His gaze felt like ice water running through my veins. "That will not be necessary. I know exactly where I'm going." "You sure about that?" I managed to ask. "Positive," he replied, and his voice seemed to come from somewhere far away. Minutes crawled by like hours. The heater, which had been working perfectly, suddenly began blowing cold air. Frost started creeping along the edges of my windshield, and my breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid cabin. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The world outside had turned hostile and alien. Even the stars seemed to disappear behind a veil of darkness. Without thinking, I started whispering a prayer I remembered from childhood, words my grandmother had taught me for protection against things that go bump in the night. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the atmosphere in the cab shifted. The passenger spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Take the next exit. I have people waiting for me." Ahead, an old and battered road sign emerged from the darkness. "Lone Wells Rest Area, half-mile." The green paint was faded and peeling, the reflective strips dulled with age. I pulled off the highway, my wheels crunching on the frost-covered gravel of what looked like an abandoned truck stop. The parking lot was completely empty, not a single other vehicle in sight. A retro neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie blue glow across a building that looked like it had been closed for years. All the windows were black as midnight. My passenger began to open the door, then paused and looked back at me. In that moment, his eyes changed. They became impossibly deep, glinting with a pale, otherworldly reflection that made my soul shudder. "Thank you for the ride, David," he said softly. "Keep your eyes on the road from now on. Some things are better left unseen." He stepped out and walked steadily toward the building. I watched in growing horror as the front doors, which should have been locked and chained, swung open soundlessly for him. He disappeared into the darkness beyond, and the doors closed behind him with no sound at all. I do not know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, my heart hammering against my ribs. Time seemed suspended in that moment, reality itself called into question. Then, like salvation breaking through a nightmare, headlights cut through the darkness. Another semi rolled into the lot and parked nearby. I practically fell out of my cab, desperate for contact with another living human being. The other driver stepped down, stretching after his long haul, then glanced toward the dark building. "Did you see a man go in there just now?" I asked, my voice shaking. Red flannel shirt, black boots, carrying a backpack. The driver shook his head, frowning with concern. "Buddy, I have not seen a soul here tonight. This place has been boarded up for years, completely abandoned on my last 3 runs through here." I turned back toward the building, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The front doors were chained shut from the outside, heavy chains and padlocks that looked like they had been there for decades. The neon sign had gone completely dark. There were no footprints in the frost-covered gravel, no sign that anyone had walked this way. Fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I crept closer and peered through a crack in the filthy glass. Inside, I could see only abandoned bathroom stalls, overturned chairs covered in dust, and the kind of silence that comes with years of emptiness. As dawn finally broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I climbed back into my cab. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened, trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew better. I did not tell anyone about that night, not at first. But rumors have a way of spreading among truckers, stories shared over coffee and pie at all-night diners. Within weeks, other drivers were talking about sightings of a specter in red on that lonely stretch of I-80, always looking for a ride east, always disappearing without a trace. When I finally broke my silence at a truck stop outside Reno, an old woman driver named Mabel listened to my story without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I have seen him too," she whispered, leaning closer across the worn Formica table. "They say he is always looking for a ride east, trying to get somewhere he can never reach." "Did he thank you when he left?" I thought about those final words, the way his eyes had changed, the gratitude in his voice that had seemed so genuine despite everything else. "Yes," I said. "He thanked me." "Then you are one of the lucky ones," she said, her weathered face serious. "Sometimes he does not." For months after that night, I avoided the Nevada stretch entirely, taking longer routes that added hours to my runs but kept me far from that cursed rest stop. I stopped picking up hitchhikers altogether and started carrying a small cross on my dashboard. But sometimes, on clear, cold nights when the moon hangs low and the highway stretches endlessly ahead, I swear I can still see a pale figure standing in the edge of my peripheral vision. He is always there and not there, waiting patiently for the next trucker willing to offer a ride to nowhere, forever seeking passage to a destination that exists somewhere between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I still drive that road occasionally now, when the money is too good to pass up. But I never stop at rest areas after midnight, and I never look too closely in my mirrors on those long, dark stretches of highway. Some things, as my passenger warned me, are better left unseen. And if you ever find yourself driving through Nevada in the small hours of the morning and you see a lone figure with his thumb out on the side of the road, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Trust me on this one, some rides are not worth the risk. They're not. I have been an owner-operator for 8 years now, running routes through the Pacific Northwest, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every rest area, and every safe spot to park between Seattle and Portland. The forests up there are dense, ancient things that have been growing since before humans ever set foot in North America. Most of the time, they are beautiful in a way that takes your breath away. But sometimes, late at night when you are alone with nothing but darkness pressing against your windows, those same forests can feel like they are hiding secrets that were never meant to be discovered. This happened to me last October during what should have been a routine delivery run from Tacoma to Eugene. I was hauling electronic components, nothing special, just another load that needed to get there on time. The weather had been acting up all week, with heavy rains making some of the mountain passes treacherous for big rigs. By the time I reached the halfway point of my route, I was running behind schedule and my logbook was showing that I needed to take my mandatory rest break whether I wanted to or not. I pulled into a truck stop called Pine Ridge Rest Area, about 40 miles south of Olympia. It was one of those older facilities that the state had built back in the 70s, tucked away in a grove of massive Douglas fir trees that towered over the parking area like ancient sentinels. During the day, the place had a rustic charm that made it popular with tourists and RV travelers. But at night, especially on a cold October evening with fog rolling in from the coast, it felt isolated and somehow vulnerable. The parking area was nearly empty when I arrived around 11:30 p.m. Just my rig and a couple of cars that probably belonged to late shift workers heading home. The facility building was closed for the night, leaving only the vending machines and the exterior lighting to push back against the darkness that seemed to pour out of the surrounding forest like a living thing. I went through my usual routine, checking my load securement, doing a quick walk-around inspection and settling into my sleeper berth with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. The plan was simple: get my required 8 hours of rest, then hit the road early to make up for lost time. I had done this same routine hundreds of times before at dozens of different locations. It should have been just another night. But from the moment I climbed into my bunk, something felt wrong. The forest around the rest area was too quiet. I am used to the normal sounds of wilderness at night: owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, maybe the distant howl of a coyote. But this silence was absolute, as if every living creature in those woods had suddenly decided to hold its breath. Even the wind, which had been gusting all evening, had died down to nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the weather, maybe the approaching fog bank that was muffling the usual forest sounds. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the oppressive quiet, I began to feel like I was being watched. It started as just a feeling, that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck when someone is staring at you. I checked my mirrors, scanned the parking lot through my windows, even got up to look outside. Nothing. Just empty pavement and the wall of trees beyond the reach of the security lights. Around 1:15 a.m. I heard the first sound. It was subtle at first, just the faintest whisper of movement in the undergrowth at the edge of the tree line. The kind of sound a deer might make stepping carefully through fallen leaves. But there was something about the rhythm of it that did not seem quite right. It was too deliberate, too measured, like something was trying very hard not to be heard. I sat up in my bunk and pressed my face to the window, straining to see into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. The fog had grown thicker, creating shifting curtains of gray that made it impossible to see more than 30 feet in any direction. But I could swear I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and tall moving between the trees. Over the next hour, the sounds grew more frequent and more disturbing. Footsteps circling my truck at a distance, always staying just outside the pool of light cast by the security fixtures. The snap of twigs being broken underfoot, and once what sounded unmistakably like breathing, deep and ragged, coming from somewhere very close to my driver's side door. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed into the cab, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the windshield, I could see the fog swirling in unnatural patterns, as if something large was moving through it just beyond the range of my vision. I hit my high beams, flooding the area in front of my truck with brilliant white light. For just a moment, I saw it clearly. The figure stood about 50 yards away at the very edge where the pavement met the forest floor. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with impossibly long limbs and a gaunt frame that seemed to bend and twist in ways that human joints simply do not allow. Its skin looked pale and mottled in the glare of my headlights, stretched tight over protruding bones. But it was the eyes that made my blood turn to ice water. They reflected my headlight beams like an animal's eyes, but they were too large, too intelligent, and filled with a hunger that I felt in the deepest part of my soul. The moment my lights hit it, the thing moved, not running like a person or even like an animal, but flowing through the fog with a fluid motion that defied everything I thought I knew about how living things are supposed to move. Within seconds, it had vanished back into the tree line, leaving me staring at empty forest and wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I had not imagined it. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming that I was in mortal danger. I reached for my CB radio to call for help, but all I got was static. My cell phone showed no signal, which was not unusual in this remote area, but the timing felt ominous. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with whatever was stalking me through those ancient trees. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The thing, whatever it was, continued to circle my truck like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, sometimes close enough that I was certain it was just outside my door. Other times retreating deeper into the forest only to return minutes later from a different direction. Around 3:30 a.m. it got bolder. I was lying in my sleeper berth, flashlight in one hand and my tire iron in the other, when I heard something that made my hair stand on end. Scratching sounds like claws being dragged across metal coming from somewhere above my head. The thing was on top of my trailer. The scratching moved slowly from the back of the trailer toward the front, each scrape of claw against metal sending vibrations through the entire rig. I could feel the truck swaying slightly under the weight of whatever was up there. When the sounds reached the area directly above my sleeper berth, they stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear breathing again. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed far too large to come from human lungs. Then, without warning, something began tapping on the roof directly above where I lay. Not the random scratching of before, but a rhythmic pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. It was trying to communicate. Terror gave way to a surge of desperate courage. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed back into the cab, then rolled down my window and stuck my head out to look up at the roof of my trailer. The fog had thickened even more, but I could make out a dark shape hunched on the aluminum surface about 10 feet behind the cab. "What do you want?" I shouted into the night. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then the shape on my roof began to move again, sliding down the back of the trailer with the same unnatural fluidity I had witnessed earlier. Within seconds, it had dropped to the ground and disappeared into the fog. But I could still feel it watching me, waiting. As dawn finally began to break through the fog, painting the forest in shades of gray and pale yellow, I heard the sound of another vehicle pulling into the rest area. A state patrol car making its routine early morning check of the facility. I have never been so glad to see law enforcement in my entire life. The officer was a middle-aged woman named Sergeant Martinez, who had been patrolling this stretch of highway for 12 years. When I told her about my night, leaving out the more unbelievable details, she nodded grimly. "You are not the first trucker to report strange encounters at this location," she said, scanning the tree line with professional alertness. "We have had at least 6 similar reports over the past 2 years, always single drivers, always during the overnight hours." She walked around my truck, examining the scratches on the roof of my trailer. The metal was gouged in long parallel lines that looked like they had been made by claws, but claws much larger than any animal native to the Pacific Northwest. "What do you think made these marks?" I asked. Sergeant Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then looked directly at me. "Officially? Probably tree branches scraping against your trailer during the windstorm last night. Unofficially?" She paused, glancing back at the forest. "I have lived in this area my whole life, and there are things in these old woods that do not appear in any field guide or natural history book. My grandmother used to tell stories about creatures that the Quinault tribe called the Tall Walkers. Beings that were here long before the first European settlers, things that most people have forgotten how to see. Before I left that morning, Sergeant Martinez gave me some advice that I have never forgotten. "If you have to stop here again," she said, "do it during daylight hours. And if you see anything moving in those trees after dark, do not try to communicate with it. Some things are better left alone." I took her advice to heart. I have driven past Pine Ridge Rest Area dozens of times since that night, but I have never stopped there after sunset again. I have also started carrying more than just a tire iron for protection, though I doubt conventional weapons would do much good against something like what I encountered. Other truckers I have talked to have shared similar stories from remote areas throughout the Northwest. Sightings of tall, gaunt figures moving through old-growth forests. Encounters with things that walk upright but are definitely not human. Most drivers do not report these incidents officially, knowing how crazy they sound, but the stories spread through the trucking community anyway. I still run routes through the Pacific Northwest regularly. The money is good, and despite what happened, I love the rugged beauty of the region. But I have learned to be more careful about where I take my mandatory rest breaks. Some places are safe for travelers and others are not. The trick is knowing the difference before you find yourself alone in the dark with something that sees you not as a fellow living being, but as prey. The scratches on my trailer took 3 months to fade completely, and even now, almost a year later, I can still see faint marks if I know where to look. They serve as a reminder that there are still wild places in this world where humans are not the dominant species, where ancient things still hunt in the shadows between the trees. If you ever find yourself driving through the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest and you need to stop for the night, choose your parking spot carefully. Stay close to other travelers, keep your doors locked, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if the forest gets too quiet, if you catch glimpses of movement in the darkness beyond your headlights, do not ignore those warning signs. Start your engine and drive away. Some encounters are not worth the risk, and some things that live in the deep woods are better left undisturbed. I am going to tell you about something that happened to me last September. Something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about reality. My name is Matthew, and I have been driving cross-country routes for 22 years. In that time, I have seen just about everything the highway can throw at you. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, and every kind of mechanical breakdown imaginable. But nothing in all those years of experience prepared me for what I encountered on a seemingly ordinary stretch of Interstate 35 through rural Iowa. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Des Moines to Kansas City, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, and I was making good time. I had left Des Moines around 8 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night and arrive in Kansas City by morning. It should have been one of those easy runs that remind you why you love life on the road. Everything was normal until around midnight. I was cruising through the heart of Iowa farmland, nothing but cornfields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway. The radio was playing classic rock, my coffee was still hot, and I was settling into that comfortable rhythm that long-haul drivers know so well. That is when I noticed the first sign that something was wrong. I had just passed a road sign that read Osceola, 47 miles, when my GPS started acting strangely. The screen flickered for a moment, then showed a route that made no sense. According to the device, I was somehow driving north instead of south, and my destination had changed to someplace called Nowhere, Iowa, that did not exist on any map. I figured it was just a technical glitch. GPS units malfunction all the time, especially in remote areas where satellite coverage can be spotty. I turned off the device and relied on my own knowledge of the route. After 22 years of driving, I knew Interstate 35 like the back of my hand. I could navigate it blindfolded. But then I passed the same road sign again. Osceola, 47 miles. Exactly the same distance, in exactly the same location. I checked my odometer and confirmed that I had been driving for over an hour since the first time I saw that sign. At 65 miles per hour, I should have covered at least 60 miles, putting me well past Osceola and deep into Missouri. But according to the sign, I had not made any progress at all. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe there were two identical signs, or maybe I had gotten turned around somehow without realizing it. But as I continued driving south, watching my mirrors and scanning the horizon for familiar landmarks, I began to accept the impossible truth. I was trapped in some kind of loop. Over the next few hours, I passed the same sequence of landmarks repeatedly. The same farmhouse with the red barn and the rusted silo, the same overpass carrying a county road across the interstate, the same billboard advertising a truck stop that, according to the sign, was only 15 miles away, but which I never seemed to reach. And always, every 53 miles exactly, the sign for Osceola promising it was 47 miles ahead. The worst part was the time. My dashboard clock was stuck at 3:17 a.m. No matter how long I drove, no matter how many miles I covered according to my odometer, the clock never advanced. My watch had stopped at the same time, and my cell phone showed no signal and a frozen display. Time itself had become meaningless in this stretch of highway that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of reality. I tried everything I could think of to break free from whatever was happening to me. I took the next exit ramp, only to find myself back on the highway heading south with no memory of how I got there. I pulled over and turned off my engine, thinking maybe I could wait it out, but when I started driving again, I was right back at the beginning of the loop. I even tried turning around and driving north, hoping to escape the trapped section of highway by going in the opposite direction. But after what felt like hours of northbound travel, I found myself approaching the same familiar landmarks from the south, as if the road had somehow twisted back on itself. The fuel gauge was the most disturbing thing of all. Logic said I should have been running out of diesel hours ago, but the needle never moved from the 3/4 tank mark where it had been when the loop began. The engine ran perfectly, consuming fuel that somehow replenished itself, defying every law of physics I understood. As the experience dragged on, I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and I had been driving for hours before the loop started. Maybe I had dozed off behind the wheel and was now trapped in some kind of nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. But everything felt too real to be a dream. I could smell the diesel fumes, feel the vibration of the engine through the steering wheel, taste the bitter coffee that never seemed to get cold. If this was a hallucination, it was the most complete and convincing one in medical history. I tried talking to other drivers on the CB radio, but all I got was static. Channel 19, which should have been busy with trucker chatter even in the middle of the night, was completely silent. It was as if I was the only person left in the world, trapped forever on this impossible stretch of highway that led nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The strangest part was how normal everything looked. This was not some hellish landscape or supernatural realm. It was just ordinary Iowa farmland under an ordinary star-filled sky. If not for the repetition and the frozen time, I might never have realized anything was wrong. The mundane nature of the trap made it somehow more terrifying than any obvious supernatural phenomenon would have been. Pure, what should have been dawn, but with the clock still frozen at 3:17 a.m. I had made the loop at least 15 times. I had memorized every detail of the 53-mile circuit, every fence post, every road sign, every slight curve in the asphalt. I knew exactly when to expect each landmark and could predict the view around every bend. That is when I started seeing the other vehicles. They appeared gradually, faintly at first, like mirages shimmering in the distance. Other trucks, cars, motorcycles, all traveling the same endless route. As I focused on them, they became more solid, more real. I could see the drivers, their faces blank and expressionless, staring straight ahead as they completed lap after lap of the same impossible circuit. I tried to signal them, flashing my lights and honking my horn, but they never responded. They seemed unaware of my presence, unaware of their situation, mechanically following the highway in a trance-like state that chilled me to the bone. I began to wonder how long they had been trapped here, whether some of them had been driving this loop for days, weeks, or even years. The thought that I might join them, that I might eventually lose awareness of my situation and become another mindless ghost driver, filled me with desperate panic. I had to find a way out before that happened, before whatever force was controlling this place claimed my consciousness as well as my physical presence. I started looking for details I had missed before, searching for some clue that might reveal the nature of my prison or provide a key to escape. That is when I noticed the mile markers were wrong. Instead of consecutive numbers marking distance along the interstate, they all showed the same number, 217. Mile marker 217 repeated endlessly, as if this section of highway existed in its own pocket of space-time. As I pondered this discovery, I began to notice that the landscape was not as identical as I had originally thought. There were subtle variations from loop to loop, small changes that suggested the repetition was not perfect. A fence might have one more post, a billboard might be slightly faded, a cloud formation might be different. It was as if I was experiencing multiple versions of the same stretch of highway, variations on a theme rather than exact duplicates. This realization gave me hope. If the loop was not perfect, if there were variations between iterations, then perhaps there was a version where the trap did not exist. I just had to find the right combination of factors that would allow me to break free. I started paying closer attention to these small differences, trying to map the variations and understand their pattern. After several more loops, I thought I detected a rhythm to the changes. The variations seemed to be building towards something, accumulating like static before a thunderstorm. Then, just as the eastern horizon should have been showing the first hints of dawn, everything changed. The frozen clock on my dashboard suddenly jumped to 6:45 a.m. The landscape around me shifted subtly, becoming more vivid and detailed. The other phantom vehicles faded away like smoke, leaving me alone on the highway once again. And there, ahead of me where the Osceola sign should have been, was a different marker entirely. Kansas City, 127 miles. I was free. I drove the remaining distance to Kansas City in a daze, unable to fully process what had happened to me. When I finally arrived at my destination, I discovered that my delivery logs showed impossible timestamps. According to my paperwork, I had somehow covered the entire distance from Des Moines to Kansas City in negative time, arriving before I had left. I have never experienced anything like that night again, but I have heard similar stories from other drivers. Tales of highways that lead nowhere, of time behaving strangely on certain routes, of sections of road that seem to exist outside normal reality. Most drivers dismiss these stories as the products of exhaustion and imagination, but I know better now. There are places where the familiar rules do not apply, where the highway becomes something more than just a path between destinations. And if you find yourself driving through one of those places in the deep hours of the night, pay attention to the mile markers. If they stop making sense, if time seems to slow down or stop entirely, if the same landmarks keep appearing no matter how far you drive, do not panic. Keep driving, keep watching, and wait for the pattern to break. Eventually, if you are lucky, the road will remember where it is supposed to lead. I need to share what happened to me during my years driving the northern routes through Montana before I finally had to give up trucking altogether. My name is Joshua, and I spent 12 years hauling freight across the loneliest stretches of highway in America. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the peace that came with having the road to myself. But there are some kinds of solitude that no human being should ever have to experience, and I learned that lesson the hard way on the remote highways of Big Sky country. It started about 2 years ago on a routine run from Billings to Great Falls. I was carrying a load of construction equipment, heavy steel beams and concrete forms that made my rig handle like a loaded freight train. The weather was clear, temperature in the low 30s, and I was making good time on Highway 87 through the heart of Montana ranch country. Around 1:30 a.m., I switched on my CB radio to channel 19, hoping to catch some trucker chatter or maybe get an update on road conditions ahead. But instead of the usual mix of conversations and static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice was calling my name. "Joshua," it said, crackling through the speaker with that distinctive CB distortion. "Joshua, can you hear me?" I grabbed the microphone, my hands suddenly shaking. In 12 years of trucking, no one had ever used my real name on the CB. Drivers go by their handles, their company call signs, anything but their actual names. It is an unwritten rule of the road. "Who is this?" I asked. "How do you know my name?" Static filled the channel for a long moment. Then the voice returned. It was different this time, older and more gravelly. "We have been waiting for you, Joshua. We have been waiting a long time." Waiting for what? Who is we? But the voice did not answer directly. Instead, it began describing my route in perfect detail. The mile markers I had just passed, the small towns sleeping in the darkness to my left and right, even the specific load I was carrying. Whoever was talking knew exactly where I was and where I was going. I tried switching to different channels, but the voices followed me. Channel 12, Channel 15, Channel 21, it did not matter. They were always there, always talking about me, always using my name in ways that made my skin crawl. Over the next hour, more voices joined the conversation. They spoke to each other about me as if I was not listening, discussing my route, my cargo, even personal details about my life that no stranger should have known. They talked about my divorce 3 years earlier, about the house I had lost in the settlement, about my ex-wife's new husband who worked at a bank in Missoula. "He is getting close to Lewistown," one voice said. It sounded like an old woman, her words stretched thin by age and static. Should we tell him about the accident? "What accident?" I demanded, keying my microphone. "What are you talking about?" "The one at mile marker 247, another voice replied. This one was younger, maybe a teenager, but there was something wrong with the way it spoke. The words came too slowly, like someone learning to talk for the first time. 3 cars. Very bad. You should slow down, Joshua. I looked at my odometer and realized with growing horror that mile marker 247 was only about 10 miles ahead of me. These voices, whoever they were giving me information about events that had not happened yet. I slowed down anyway, reducing my speed from 65 to 45 as I approached the area they had mentioned. Sure enough, just past mile marker 247, I saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles scattered across both lanes of the highway. State police, ambulances, a fire truck with its ladder extended. 3 mangled cars were scattered across the median, and I could see paramedics working frantically around what looked like multiple casualties. I pulled over and tried to help, but the state trooper directing traffic waved me on. "Keep moving, driver," he shouted over the noise of the emergency equipment. "We have got this under control." As I drove past the accident scene, the voices on my CB started laughing. Not the normal laughter of human beings, but something hollow and echoing like sounds bouncing around inside an empty barrel. "Did you see, Joshua?" the old woman's voice asked. "Did you see what we showed you?" "How did you know?" I whispered into the microphone. "How could you possibly know about that accident before it happened?" "We know lots of things," the teenage voice replied. We know about the truck stop in Great Falls where you always eat breakfast. We know about the waitress there, the one with the red hair who you think is pretty but who you are too shy to talk to. We know about the motel room you keep reserved for Tuesday nights, room 237 at the Roadway Inn. Every detail was correct. I had been eating at the same truck stop in Great Falls for 3 years, and there was indeed a red-haired waitress there who I had developed a crush on, but had never worked up the courage to approach. Room 237 at the Roadway Inn was my regular spot, reserved standing for my weekly runs through the area. "What do you want from me?" I asked. The voices went silent for several minutes, leaving only static and the distant murmur of other channels bleeding through. When they returned, there were more of them than before. I counted at least 7 distinct speakers, ranging from what sounded like a small child to an elderly man with a thick accent I could not identify. They began telling me stories. Stories about other truckers who had driven these same routes, drivers who had disappeared without explanation or been found dead in their cabs with no apparent cause. They spoke about accidents that had been arranged, about mechanical failures that had been orchestrated, about drivers who had been driven insane by voices on their CB radios. "We collect them," the child's voice explained with innocent enthusiasm. "The lonely ones, the ones who drive at night when nobody else is around. They come to live with us in the space between the channels. That is where we are now," the old man added. "In the static between frequencies and the empty places where radio waves go to die. It is not so bad here, Joshua. There is no traffic, no deadlines, no dispatchers yelling at you about delivery times. Just the open road forever and always." I tried to turn off the radio, but it would not shut off. The voices continued even when I unplugged it from the power source, even when I removed the fuses from the electrical panel. They were not coming through the radio anymore, they were coming from inside my own head. As I continued driving toward Great Falls, the voices became more personal, more invasive. They began discussing my thoughts as I had them, commenting on my fears and reactions in real time. When I wondered if I was losing my mind, they laughed and assured me that sanity was overrated. When I considered pulling over and calling for help, they reminded me that my cell phone had no signal in this remote area. "There is nowhere to run, Joshua," the old woman said gently. "We are inside you now. We know everything you know, feel everything you feel. You belong to us." By the time I reached Great Falls, I was barely holding on to my sanity. The voices had been talking continuously for over 6 hours, describing every mile of road, every passing car, every thought that crossed my mind. They knew my social security number, my bank account balance, the name of my first dog, the recurring nightmare I had been having since childhood. I completed my delivery in a daze, unloaded my cargo with shaking hands, and checked into my usual room at the Roadway Inn. But the voices followed me there, commenting on the faded wallpaper, the broken air conditioning unit, the way I always slept on the left side of the bed. Over the next several weeks, the situation only got worse. The voices were with me constantly now, not just while I was driving, but every moment of every day. They critiqued my choice of breakfast cereal, discussed the quality of truck stop coffee, offered unwanted advice about my driving technique. Sleep became impossible because they would whisper continuously in my ears, telling stories about other drivers they had collected over the years. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of them. I saw doctors who prescribed medication for schizophrenia. I visited a priest who attempted an exorcism. I even consulted a psychiatrist who specialized in stress-related disorders in professional drivers. Nothing helped. The voices remained, as constant and inescapable as my own heartbeat. The final straw came 3 months later on another night run through Montana. I was hauling automotive parts from Bozeman to Helena when the voices began giving me directions that differed from my planned route. They insisted I take a series of back roads through the wilderness, promising they would show me something special if I followed their guidance. Against my better judgment, I obeyed. The alternative routes led me deeper into the mountains along increasingly narrow and treacherous roads that barely accommodated my large rig. Hours passed as I climbed switchbacks and navigated hairpin turns, following directions from voices that laughed and whispered encouragement with every mile. Finally, they directed me to stop at an overlook beside a deep canyon. As I set my air brakes, they explained what they wanted to show me. "Look down there, Joshua," the child's voice said excitedly. "Look at all the trucks." I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the overlook, then shined the beam down into the canyon below. What I saw made my knees buckle with terror. Hundreds of semi-trucks were scattered across the canyon floor, rusted and twisted wrecks that looked like they had been there for years or even decades. Some were partially buried by rock slides, others were burned out shells, but all of them showed the unmistakable signs of having driven straight off the cliff above. "These are our friends," the old woman's voice explained, "drivers who decided to join us permanently. It is very peaceful down there, Joshua. No more schedules, no more traffic, no more loneliness, just eternal rest in the company of fellow travelers." That was when I understood what the voices wanted from me. They were not just tormenting me for entertainment, they were recruiting me. Gradually wearing down my resistance until I would be willing to drive my truck off a cliff just to make them stop talking. I ran back to my rig, started the engine, and drove away from that overlook as fast as the winding mountain roads would allow. The voices screamed at me for hours, angry that I had rejected their invitation, but I kept driving until I reached the main highway again. The next morning, I turned in my resignation to the trucking company and walked away from the profession that had been my life for 12 years. The voices still talk to me sometimes, usually late at night when the world is quiet and I am alone with my thoughts. But they have less power over me now that I am not isolated on remote highways. Less ability to manipulate my reality when I am surrounded by other people in normal human conversation. I work at a warehouse now, loading and unloading trucks for other drivers. It is honest work, and it keeps me grounded in the normal world where voices come from human beings instead of empty frequencies in the radio spectrum. Sometimes I see the fear in a driver's eyes when they talk about the long-haul routes through Montana, and I want to warn them about what waits out there in the darkness between radio stations. But I know they would not believe me, just like I would not have believed anyone who had tried to warn me. So I keep my story to myself, and I count myself lucky to have escaped the fate of those drivers whose trucks rest forever in that hidden canyon. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear them calling my name from somewhere far away, promising me that the road is waiting whenever I am ready to return. I need to tell someone about what happened to me at a truck stop in Arizona last year. It is something that still gives me nightmares, and I hope sharing it might help other female drivers stay safe out there. My name is Brittany, and I have been driving professionally for 7 years. Being a woman in this industry means you learn to be extra careful, extra aware, and extra prepared for situations that male drivers might never have to face. I was hauling a load of textiles from Los Angeles to Phoenix, a routine run that I had made dozens of times before. It was early November and the desert nights were getting cold, so I was looking forward to a hot meal and maybe a shower before getting my mandatory rest. I pulled into a large truck stop just outside Flagstaff around 9:30 p.m., one of those 24-hour places with a restaurant, convenience store, and full-service facilities. The parking lot was about half full, which was normal for that time of night. I found a spot near the back where I could park my rig without blocking anyone, but close enough to the main building that I would feel safe walking back and forth. As a woman driver, you learn to think about these things: lighting, visibility, escape routes. They become second nature after a while. I went through my usual routine, secured my load, did a quick inspection of my equipment, then headed inside to grab dinner and use the facilities. The truck stop was busy but not crowded, filled with the usual mix of drivers, travelers, and local workers stopping by for coffee and snacks. I noticed him while I was ordering food at the restaurant counter. He was sitting alone in a booth near the window, a thin man in his 40s with greasy hair and clothes that looked like they had not been washed in weeks. What caught my attention was not his appearance, but the way he was watching me. His eyes followed my every movement as I ordered my meal, paid at the register, and found a table on the opposite side of the dining area. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food and the trucking magazine I had brought in with me. But every time I looked up, he was still staring. Not the casual glance you might give to another person in a restaurant, but an intense, predatory stare that made my skin crawl. When I finished eating and got up to leave, he got up too. When I stopped at the convenience store to buy coffee for the road, he lingered nearby, pretending to browse the magazine rack while keeping me in his peripheral vision. When I walked back out to the parking lot, he followed at a distance. My truck was parked in a row with several others, and as I approached it, I could see him reflected in the side mirrors, hanging back about 50 yards, but definitely following me. Every instinct I had developed over 7 years of solo driving was screaming warnings. I climbed into my cab and immediately locked the doors, then sat there for a few minutes watching him in my mirrors. He had stopped next to a pickup truck several spaces away and was making a show of checking his tires, but his attention was clearly still focused on me. I considered driving away immediately, finding another place to take my rest break, but federal regulations required me to log 8 hours of off-duty time before I could legally drive again. I was already pushing close to my maximum allowable hours, and I could not afford to get pulled over for a logbook violation. Instead, I decided to wait him out. Surely he would get tired of whatever game he was playing and move on to bother someone else, or better yet, just leave entirely. I settled into my sleeper berth with a book and tried to relax, checking my mirrors periodically to see if he was still out there. He was. For over an hour, he stayed near that pickup truck, sometimes sitting on the tailgate, sometimes walking around the vehicle, but always positioned where he could keep an eye on my truck. Other drivers came and went around us, but he seemed oblivious to everything except me. Around 11:30 p.m., I finally saw him walk back toward the main building, and I allowed myself to relax a little. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he was just some harmless weirdo who got his kicks from making women uncomfortable. I closed my curtains, turned off my interior lights, and tried to get some sleep. I was awakened around 2:15 a.m. by the sound of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling my truck. I lay perfectly still in my bunk, listening as the footsteps moved from the front of my rig to the driver's side, then around to the back of the trailer, then up the passenger side. Whoever was out there was taking their time, studying my truck, looking for weaknesses. The footsteps stopped near my passenger door, and I could hear the soft sound of someone breathing heavily just outside. Then came the gentle rattle of a door handle being tested. My passenger door was locked, but the sound of someone trying to open it made my blood turn to ice. I reached for my cell phone to call 911, but realized I had no signal. The truck stop was in one of those dead zones where cellular coverage was spotty at best. I was on my own. The person outside moved to my driver's door and tested that handle as well. When it did not open, I heard what sounded like metal tools being scraped against the lock mechanism. He was trying to break into my truck. I grabbed the tire iron I kept under my bunk and crept forward to the cab, staying low and trying not to make any noise that would alert him to the fact that I was awake. Through a gap in my curtains, I could see a figure hunched beside my driver's door, working on the lock with what looked like a set of lockpicks. That is when I realized this was not some random opportunist. This was someone who had come prepared, someone who had done this before. The way he moved, the tools he carried, the patience he showed, everything about his behavior suggested experience and planning. I was trapped. If I tried to start my truck and drive away, he would hear the engine and might panic, possibly becoming violent. If I stayed where I was, he might succeed in getting the door open, and I would be cornered in my sleeper berth with nowhere to run. I decided to take the offensive. I moved to my driver's seat as quietly as possible, then suddenly flipped on all my exterior lights and laid on the horn. The blast of sound shattered the night silence, and I saw the figure outside stumble backward in surprise. "Get away from my truck!" I screamed through the closed window. "I am calling the police." The man looked up at me, and in the harsh glare of my headlights, I could see his face clearly for the first time. His eyes were wild and unfocused, his expression a mixture of rage and frustration. He was not just some harmless creep. This was someone dangerous, someone who had been planning to do serious harm. Instead of running away, he moved toward my driver's door again, this time producing what looked like a crowbar. He was going to try to force his way in. I kept the horn blaring while I reached for my CB radio, broadcasting on channel 19 for any driver who might be listening. "Mayday, Mayday, this is a female driver under attack at the Flagstaff truck stop. I need immediate assistance. Repeat, I need help now." The response was immediate. Several drivers came back over the radio, and I could see lights coming on in other trucks around the parking lot. Within minutes, at least 4 other truckers were walking toward my location, some carrying flashlights and tire irons of their own. The man with the crowbar saw them coming and finally decided to retreat. He ran toward the pickup truck he had been lurking near earlier, but instead of getting in it, he disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. One of the drivers who had come to help tried to follow him, but he had vanished into the desert scrub. The state police arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by the local sheriff's department. They took my statement and examined my truck for evidence of the attempted break-in, finding scratches around both door locks that confirmed someone had indeed tried to pick them. The detective who handled the case told me that I was lucky to have fought back when I did. Over the past 18 months, there had been at least 6 similar incidents at truck stops throughout Arizona and New Mexico, all targeting female drivers who were resting alone. In 3 of those cases, the attacker had succeeded in gaining entry to the cab, and the outcomes had been tragic. They never caught the man who attacked me that night. The pickup truck he had been using turned out to be stolen, abandoned in a parking lot in Flagstaff the next morning. Security cameras at the truck stop had malfunctioned conveniently, providing no useful footage of the incident. I completed my run to Phoenix the next day, but I have never felt the same level of security while taking my rest breaks. I installed additional locks on my doors, carry multiple communication devices in case my cell phone fails, and always park as close to the main building as possible. I also invested in a personal alarm system that connects directly to emergency services. The experience taught me that the dangers female drivers face on the road go beyond mechanical breakdowns and bad weather. There are predators out there who specifically target women in the trucking industry, taking advantage of our isolation and the remote locations where we are required to rest. I have shared my story with other female drivers whenever possible, hoping to help them stay alert and prepared. We look out for each other in this industry, sharing information about safe parking spots and dangerous locations, but it should not be our responsibility alone to stay safe. Truck stops need better security, better lighting, and better surveillance systems. Law enforcement needs to take these attacks seriously and coordinate their efforts across state lines. And trucking companies need to provide their female drivers with the resources and training necessary to protect themselves. Until those changes happen, we have to rely on our own awareness and preparation. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Do not hesitate to call for help or make noise if you feel threatened. And remember that your safety is more important than any delivery schedule or company policy. I still drive solo routes, and I still love the freedom and independence that comes with life on the road. But I am more careful now. more aware of the risks that come with being a woman alone in remote places. The predators are out there waiting for opportunities, and the only way to stay safe is to make sure they never get the chance to strike. What I am about to tell you happened to me 6 months ago on what should have been a routine regional run through rural Kentucky. I need to share this because I still do not understand what occurred that night, and I hope maybe someone else has experienced something similar. My name is Samantha, and I have been driving the same routes through Kentucky and Tennessee for 4 years. I know these roads like I know my own reflection, every curve and hill, every truck stop and way station. But on this particular night, the familiar became alien, and I found myself trapped in a version of reality that still haunts my dreams. I was hauling auto parts from Louisville to Nashville, a route I had driven at least 50 times before. It was a clear October evening, temperature in the low 60s, perfect driving weather. I left Louisville around 7 p.m., planning to make the delivery by midnight and then catch some sleep before heading back north the next morning. Everything was normal for the first hour. I cruised south on Interstate 65, listening to country music and watching the sunset paint the Kentucky countryside in shades of gold and amber. I passed all the familiar landmarks: the Jim Beam Distillery, the exit for Bardstown, the rolling hills dotted with horse farms that made this part of the state famous. But somewhere around the 8:30 mark, things started to feel different. The first sign that something was wrong came when I passed a billboard that I had never seen before. It was advertising a restaurant called the Crossroads Diner and claimed it was the next exit just 2 miles ahead. I had driven this stretch of highway dozens of times, and there was no restaurant at that exit, just a small gas station and a few houses scattered through the woods. I figured it was a new business, something that had opened since my last run through the area. But as I approached the exit, I could see that the landscape around it had changed too. The gas station was gone, replaced by a cluster of buildings that looked older, more weathered, as if they had been there for decades instead of being newly constructed. I decided to take the exit and check out this mysterious diner, curious about how I could have missed such a significant change to my regular route. But when I turned off the interstate, the exit ramp led to a road I did not recognize. Instead of the narrow county road that should have been there, I found myself on a 4-lane highway that stretched into the distance through terrain that looked subtly wrong. The hills were the right shape, and the trees were the right species, but everything seemed slightly more vivid, more detailed than it should have been. It was like looking at a high-definition version of reality, too sharp and clear to be entirely natural. The Crossroads Diner turned out to be a classic 1950s-style establishment, complete with neon signs and chrome fixtures that gleamed under parking lot lights. The parking lot was full of vehicles, but they were all cars and pickup trucks from decades past. Classic Chevrolets and Fords from the 60s and 70s, all in perfect condition as if they had just rolled off the showroom floor. I parked my rig and walked inside, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. The diner was packed with customers, all dressed in clothing styles that seemed to belong to previous eras. Men in work clothes and fedoras, women in dresses and hairdos that I had only seen in old photographs. They all looked up when I entered, and their faces showed polite curiosity but no recognition that anything about my appearance was unusual or out of place. I ordered coffee from a waitress who could have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting, then asked her about the interstate construction that must have happened recently. She looked at me with genuine confusion. "Interstate?" she said. "Honey, there is not any interstate around here, just the old state highway that runs north to Louisville and south to Nashville. Has been that way for as long as I can remember." I tried to explain that I had just driven off Interstate 65, but she insisted there was no such road. Other customers joined the conversation, all of them agreeing that the main highway through the area was State Route 31, a 2-lane road that had been the primary north-south corridor for decades. Feeling increasingly disoriented, I paid for my coffee and walked back outside. My truck was still there in the parking lot, looking massive and modern next to the vintage automobiles surrounding it. But when I climbed into the cab and tried to navigate back to the interstate, I discovered that my GPS was showing locations that did not make sense. According to the device, I was in a town called Millerville, Kentucky, population 2,847. But there was no such town on any map I had ever seen. The GPS was showing roads and highways that differed completely from what I knew to be the actual layout of the area. I decided to ignore the GPS and navigate by memory, driving what I thought should be the route back to Interstate 65. But after 20 minutes of driving through countryside that looked familiar yet subtly different, I found myself on a 2-lane highway marked as Route 31, heading south toward Nashville. This was impossible. Route 31 was a historical designation that had been replaced by the interstate system decades ago. Yet here I was, driving on a road that officially no longer existed through a landscape that seemed to be a mixture of the Kentucky I knew and some alternate version that had developed along different lines. Other vehicles on Route 31 were a mixture of vintage cars and more modern vehicles like mine. The drivers I could see looked normal enough, but there was something in their expressions, a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested they were as confused as I was, but had given up trying to understand their situation. I tried my CB radio, hoping to contact other truck drivers who might explain what was happening. Channel 19 was active, but the conversations I heard were strange. Drivers were discussing routes and destinations that did not exist, talking about companies I had never heard of, referencing trucking regulations that bore no resemblance to current federal requirements. Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound on Route 31, one voice said. Anyone know if the scales are running at the Millerville checkpoint? That is a negative, Moondog, another voice replied. Haven't seen a scale house on this route in 15 years. You might be thinking of the old Interstate 65 corridor, but that got shut down after the big accident back in '73. I keyed my microphone, hoping to get clarification. This is a southbound driver looking for Interstate 65, I said. Can anyone give me directions to get back to the main highway? The channel went silent for a long moment. Then the first voice came back. Driver, there is no Interstate 65 in this area. Route 31 is the main north-south highway through central Kentucky. Has been since they built it back in 1926. You feeling okay out there? I was not feeling okay. I was beginning to suspect that I had somehow driven into a version of Kentucky where the interstate highway system had never been built, where the old federal highways still carried the bulk of long-distance traffic, where small towns like Millerville had continued to thrive instead of being bypassed and forgotten. For the next 3 hours, I drove south on Route 31 through this alternate Kentucky, passing through towns that should not have existed and seeing landmarks that had been demolished or replaced decades ago in my version of reality. Everything was slightly different, slightly wrong, as if I was looking at the world through a distorted mirror. The worst part was the growing realization that other people around me seemed to accept this reality as normal. The drivers I spoke to on the CB, the customers at gas stations where I stopped for directions, even the state police officers I saw patrolling the highway, all acted as if this version of Kentucky was the only one that had ever existed. Around 2 a.m., I finally saw signs for Nashville ahead. But when I reached the city limits, I discovered that this was not the Nashville I knew. The skyline was different, dominated by buildings that looked like they belonged to the 1960s rather than the 21st century. The interstate loop around the city was absent, replaced by a network of state highways that wound through neighborhoods I did not recognize. I managed to find my delivery destination, but the warehouse was in a location that should have been occupied by a shopping center in my version of reality. The receiving clerk seemed surprised to see me, claiming they had not been expecting a delivery until the following week. But he accepted my load anyway, and I got my paperwork signed without any major complications. By dawn, I was exhausted and confused, desperate to find my way back to the reality I knew. I started driving north on what the local signs insisted was Route 31, retracing my path from the night before. But somewhere around sunrise, as I was passing through an area that looked like it should have been near Bardstown, the landscape began to shift again. Gradually, the vintage buildings and classic cars gave way to the modern Kentucky I recognized. Route 31 became Interstate 65. The small towns resumed their familiar names, and my GPS began showing locations that matched my memory of the area. By the time I reached Louisville, everything was back to normal. The Crossroads Diner was gone, replaced by the small gas station I remembered. The exit looked exactly as it should have, and there was no sign that the events of the previous night had ever occurred. I completed my return trip without incident, but I have never been able to explain what happened during those 8 hours in alternate Kentucky. I have researched the history of the area, looking for references to towns like Millerville or restaurants like the Crossroads Diner, but I have found nothing that matches my experience. Other drivers I have spoken to have shared similar stories, tales of roads that lead to places that should not exist, of getting lost in familiar territory and finding themselves in versions of reality where history unfolded differently. Most of them dismiss these experiences as the products of fatigue and stress, but I know what I saw and experienced that night. I still drive the Louisville to Nashville route regularly, but I have never encountered that alternate version of Kentucky again. Sometimes late at night when I am driving through the more remote stretches of highway, I wonder if those roads are still there, existing parallel to the ones we know, accessible only under certain circumstances that I do not understand. The experience has made me more aware of the strangeness that can lurk beneath the surface of familiar places. There are layers to reality that most of us never see, alternate versions of the world that exist alongside the one we think we know. For truck drivers who spend their lives traveling between distant places, the boundaries between these realities may be thinner, easier to cross when conditions are right. I have learned to pay closer attention to the small details during my runs, watching for signs that the world around me is beginning to shift into something different. Because if it happened once, it could happen again, and next time I want to be prepared for the journey into the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. I have to tell someone about what has been happening to me for the past 8 months. Every time I think about quitting trucking altogether, something tells me I need to share this story. Maybe to warn other drivers, or maybe just to convince myself that I am not losing my mind. My name is Taylor, and I have been driving solo runs across the desert Southwest for 6 years. I always preferred the night shift, loved the solitude and the way the highway looks under starlight. But now the darkness holds something I never wanted to find, and I am not sure I can ever escape it. It started last January on a routine run from Phoenix to Albuquerque. I was hauling electronics, expensive stuff that required careful handling and tight security. The weather was perfect, clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and unlimited visibility. I had left Phoenix around 10 p.m., planning to drive straight through and arrive in Albuquerque by dawn. Everything was normal for the first few hours. I cruised east on Interstate 40, listening to late-night talk radio and watching the desert landscape roll past under my headlights. The highway was mostly empty except for the occasional car or long-haul trucker heading in the opposite direction. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, I first noticed the figure in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of my own interior lighting or a shadow cast by my load straps. But as I watched more carefully, I began to see that there was something distinctly human-shaped moving in the darkness behind my trailer. It appeared to be a tall, thin person dressed in dark clothing walking at a steady pace that somehow kept exact time with my truck's speed. Even though I was traveling at 70 miles per hour, the figure maintained its position about 50 yards behind my trailer. Never falling back, never catching up, just maintaining that precise distance like it was tethered to my rig by an invisible rope. I slowed down to 60, then 55, thinking maybe I would lose whatever optical illusion was creating this effect. But the figure slowed down with me, maintaining that exact same distance. When I sped back up to 75, it matched my speed perfectly, never breaking stride, never showing any sign of effort despite the impossible pace. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe it was some kind of reflection from a vehicle in the opposite direction. But the figure followed me across the highway, still walking steadily behind my trailer as if the lane change had never occurred. I grabbed my CB radio and called out to any drivers who might be in the area. Breaker 19, this is an eastbound driver on I-40 near Winslow. Anyone else seeing anything strange out here tonight? The response came back immediately. Negative, eastbound. Highway looks clear from here. You feeling okay out there? I wanted to describe what I was seeing, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Oh, person walking behind my truck at highway speeds, following me across lane changes, matching my speed no matter how fast or slow I drove. No one would believe it, and I was beginning to wonder if I should believe it myself. For the next hour, the figure continued its impossible pursuit. I watched it in my mirrors, trying to make out details, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No matter how I adjusted my mirrors or turned on additional lights, I could never see its face or any specific features. It was just a dark shape in the rough outline of a person, walking with mechanical precision through the desert night. Around 3 a.m., I pulled into a truck stop near Winona, hoping to break whatever spell was holding this apparition to my truck. I parked under the brightest lights I could find and immediately jumped out to check behind my trailer. Nothing. The pavement was empty, showing no sign that anyone had been walking there. But as I climbed back into my cab and checked my mirrors, the figure was there again, standing motionless about 50 yards behind my truck, waiting. I tried to ignore it, went inside the truck stop, bought coffee, used the restroom, called my dispatcher to check in. But when I came back outside 20 minutes later, it was still there in exactly the same position, as if it had never moved. I completed the rest of my run to Albuquerque with the figure following behind me every mile. When I finally reached my destination and backed up to the loading dock, I watched in my mirrors as it simply faded away like smoke, vanishing into the dawn light. I hoped that would be the end of it, that whatever I had encountered was tied to that specific route or that particular night. But I was wrong. Over the following weeks, the figure began appearing on other runs, other highways, always in my mirrors, always maintaining that exact distance behind my trailer. It did not matter where I was driving or what time of day it was. Desert highways, mountain passes, city streets, the figure was always there. During daylight runs, it appeared as a heat mirage, shimmering in the distance but clearly maintaining the shape of a walking person. At night, it was a solid shadow moving through darkness with inhuman persistence. The worst part was how it began to affect my driving. I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, so obsessed with watching the figure that I started missing turns, running red lights, even rear-ending another vehicle at a stop sign, because I was staring at my mirrors instead of watching the road ahead. Other drivers started commenting on my erratic behavior. My dispatcher received complaints about my sudden lane changes, my inconsistent speeds, my failure to respond to radio calls because I was too focused on whatever was behind me. I tried switching to day runs, thinking maybe the figure would be less visible in sunlight, but it adapted, becoming more translucent but still clearly present, still walking, with that same mechanical stride that matched my speed exactly. I tried taking vacation time, staying home for 2 weeks, hoping to break whatever connection had formed between me and this impossible follower. But the first time I got back in a truck, there it was again, waiting patiently behind my trailer as if it had never left. That was when it started getting into my cab. I first noticed it during a night run through New Mexico in late March. I was checking my mirrors as usual when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, but I could swear I had seen a dark shape seated in my passenger seat for just a split second. Over the following weeks, these sightings became more frequent and more distinct. The figure would appear in my passenger seat, always facing forward, never moving or speaking, just sitting there with that same light-absorbing darkness that made it impossible to see any details. At first, it would only appear for a few seconds before fading away, but gradually the visitations lasted longer. Minutes at a time, then entire hours where I would be driving with this impossible passenger sitting silently beside me. I tried talking to it, asking what it wanted, why it was following me, but it never responded, never acknowledged my presence, never gave any indication that it was aware of my existence. It just sat there, a hole in reality shaped like a person, accompanying me on my endless journeys across the American Southwest. The real terror began when it started reaching for the steering wheel. The first time it happened, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I was driving through the Arizona desert around 2 a.m. when I saw in my peripheral vision a dark hand extending toward my steering wheel. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. But I could feel a cold presence beside me, could sense something that wanted to take control of my truck. Over the following weeks, these attempts became more frequent and more aggressive. The figure would reach for my steering wheel, my gear shift, my brake pedal, trying to influence my driving in ways that would have been catastrophic if it had succeeded. I started wearing gloves and long sleeves, thinking maybe physical barriers would help, but the cold touch of its presence could penetrate any material. When it reached for the controls, I could feel ice-cold fingers brushing against my hands, could sense an alien intelligence trying to override my own will. The worst incident happened 2 months ago on a night run between Tucson and El Paso. I was driving through a particularly remote stretch of desert when the figure appeared in my passenger seat and immediately began reaching for the steering wheel. This time, instead of just brushing against my hands, it seemed to partially merge with my own movements, creating a horrible sensation of shared control. For several terrifying minutes, I was not entirely in command of my own truck. The steering wheel would turn slightly without my input. The speed would increase or decrease according to some alien will that was not my own. I fought against this influence with every ounce of strength I possessed, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, forcing my foot to maintain pressure on the accelerator despite the creature's attempts to make me brake or accelerate. Finally, I managed to pull over at a rest area and stop the truck. The moment I set the air brakes, the figure vanished, leaving me alone and shaking in my cab. That was when I realized that this thing, whatever it was, did not just want to follow me. It wanted to possess me, to take control of my truck and use it for purposes I could not comprehend. I have been trying to find ways to get rid of it ever since. I have consulted priests, paranormal investigators, even a Native American shaman who specializes in desert spirits. Some of them claim to sense the presence when I describe it, but none of them have been able to remove it or explain what it wants. The shaman told me that certain places in the desert are thin spots where the boundary between our world and others becomes permeable. He suggested that I might have picked up this follower by driving through one of these areas during a time when conditions were right for such contact. But knowing what caused it does not help me get rid of it. The figure is still there, still following behind my truck on every run, still appearing in my passenger seat when conditions are right. And I can feel it getting stronger, more solid, more capable of influencing the physical world. I am afraid that soon it will be able to take complete control, to use my truck as a weapon or to drive it to some destination that exists in its reality rather than mine. When that happens, I do not think I will be coming back. I have started carrying a small video camera in my cab, trying to document these encounters, but the figure never appears on film. It exists only in mirrors and peripheral vision, in the spaces between what is real and what should be impossible. If you are a driver reading this, be careful about the routes you choose, especially through remote desert areas where the landscape has remained unchanged for thousands of years. There are things out there that are older than our highways, older than our civilization, and some of them are still hungry for contact with the modern world. Pay attention to your mirrors, but not too much attention. If you start seeing things that should not be there, do not try to investigate or understand them. Just keep driving, stay focused on the road ahead, and hope that whatever is following you eventually loses interest and moves on to someone else. Because once it attaches itself to you, once it decides that you belong to it, there may be no way to break free. And in the end, you might find yourself becoming a passenger in your own life, watching helplessly as something else takes control of the wheel.